topic today is, as you probably all know, Christian magic. Katerina's brought this great book about Christian magic from the early periods of its development. This is a conversation that I've been looking forward to for a long time. I have, well, let's say a few biases to pick apart with Christianity. And I was really looking forward to the opportunity to do that in a conversation, and especially about something that I very much enjoy, which is magic. So first, some introductions I think might be in order. I do see some unfamiliar faces. So I'm Daniel. I'm a student of cognitive science and philosophy at the University of Toronto. I'm going to be finished my undergrad finally at the end of this year. So very much looking forward to that. I do a lot of organizing, especially in the psychedelic community, doing fundraisers and conferences and all of that to spread awareness about the research into psychedelics, altered states, that brand of research, and to also try to raise some funds to make that happen. Katerina is a colleague of mine. She's in her PhD currently in religious studies. And do you want to say more about yourself? I think.
Sure. So I just began the first year of my PhD program. I finished my master's this summer. My master's was in Kabbalah and Jewish mysticism, and my current PhD project has to do with a saint called Cyprian of Antioch. He is, like TLDR, he is an early Christian saint who was a magician who converted to Christianity, and then even though he's supposed to be protecting people from magic, he also becomes a kind of patron of magic. And there's a lot of books that claim to be his original spell book that are spread across Europe, and I'm interested in looking at their transmission, how they change attitudes towards magic in places like Germany, Spain, and eventually Brazil once they come through the Portuguese.
So to begin, I think we should start with some definitions. The main one being magic.
Oh, no.
Yeah, I know that's a complicated thing, which is why we got to cover it. So what are we talking about?
So one of the things that we always talk about in the Department for the Study of Religion is how difficult it is to define religion and terms like that, because it can mean a lot of things to a lot of different people. The standard sort of approach to questions of religion, people think of beliefs and practices and rituals, but not everything that we consider religious has those elements. A similar situation goes on with magic, where it's often especially in early scholarship, considered to be a pejorative word, right? This is correct religion, and this is mere sorcery. This is the right way to worship something, and this is blasphemy and magic and petty sorcery and so on. And so we get this tension, this polemic at the heart of it. On the other hand, what someone's religion can be magic to you if you think that they're wrong, or that they're pagans and they're blasphemers and so on. So the current scholarship of magic is trying to really move away from this and look at things, well, on the one hand, there's a lot of different words that are associated with the cluster of ideas we think of when we think of magic: witchcraft, sorcery, charming, illusion, talismans and amulets, and so on. A cluster of objects and ritual practices that define these things with different groups. So sometimes what a person doesn't consider to be magic, but they consider to be just an approach to spirituality, is seen as magic by another group. So all that aside, generally what we look at, the phenomena that we're interested in, happens to be ways of compelling spirits to do things for you. So that's one way to look at things, especially one kind of branch or school of magic, which is forcing beings to do things for you. Now, it doesn't have to be forcing, it can also be bribing them, like through offerings and so on. But it also can very much be an aggressive thing, which actually features in a lot of Christian magic, which we'll be talking about. There's other versions of it, which include divination, or trying to talk to spirits, necromancy, dream incubations, such as when you have a dream and you're trying to make certain things show up in that dream. There's different techniques in order to sort of know the future, or in order to know the hidden properties of plants and animals, to know like which plant belongs to which planet, for example. So there's this kind of school of, on the one hand, and different scholars have different ways of categorizing these things. So some scholars, for example, are have this idea that there's natural magic, which has to do with the world. So which animals belong to which planets, how can we heal people, and so on. And then there's demonic or spirit magic, which has to do with compelling spirits. And then people problematize those categories and make them even more complicated, where you have magic that has to do with particular cultural attitudes. You have magic that has to do with, for example, sympathy. So the idea is if I want to do a curse on someone, I can steal some of their hair, because that has a link to them. It's not them, literally, right? But because it was on their head or it came from them, it's a link to them. Or spit, for example, is a common one that you see in a lot of spells across cultures, because it carries the essence of the person. Or, for example, the footprints of someone, because they were once there, so it has a less intense link, but you can still harvest it. So all these things are considered sympathetic in the sense that there's a sympathy between the objects, right? There's also imitative magic. So you get like, I'm sure everyone's seen a puppet, like a doll that you're stabbing with pins and so on. So that idea is like, it's not literally that person, but it is a representation of that person. And so what you do to it will be applied to that person. And so so again, I'm throwing out various definitions for categories of magic because the truth is that very few scholars have a consensus on what it is. But everyone at their core has an idea of what it might be because they've seen it in TV shows and they've heard about it and they grew up with fairy tales about it and so on. So generally, these are probability enhancing technologies. We sometimes call them like ritual specialists instead of magicians because they may not identify as a magician, they may identify as a priest of a god. But the idea is they have particular a particular training, or either through spirits or through other people, as to how to approach the world in a way to affect it or change it. So again, influence probabilities. So yeah, that's my long spiel, but long story short, we don't know. We don't have a consensus yet, but there are lots of things that apply and that we are studying.
I want to get you to unpack that term a little bit more.
Yeah.
Probability enhancing technologies. So what is going on in the world such that human minds can affect probabilities? What does it mean to affect a probability?
So key to, and again, I have to like put in very big scare quotes, most or many or some, because it doesn't apply always universally. But key to a lot of different magical attitudes towards the world is that everything's interconnected. The idea is that there's nothing really, like spirits or forces are permeating everything, right? It's a kind of animistic worldview, right? That, the rocks are alive or the plants are alive and so on. So anything can be influenced. There's a sympathy between people. And like with the example of the voodoo doll, allegedly, it's not even from voodoo, but the puppets or the footprints that you collect from people or the hair off people's heads, all these things which can allegedly affect other individuals. The idea is there's links to things, right? And there's like footprints in terms of like, how can I say this? Like, there's like almost ephemera between them, right? You can capture something. And so the reason these things can affect each other is because they're all interconnected. So this worldview encompasses spirits. You may not be aware that you're being haunted or that your spirits are affecting your mood or behaviors, right? But they're still there. Or you can have this idea that you don't know that you're being affected by the planets because astrology for a long time was considered a very important science. It wasn't considered to be, stuff in the horoscopes. And it was much more complicated than just horoscopy. There were astrologers whose main purpose was to tell kings when the best time to go to battle was, when the best time to avoid, when marriages should happen, whether or not people should get married in the first place, like this monarch should they unite my princess with your prince. They were very complicated and very, and people were considered very like honorable, right? This was a major thing that you need to study a lot of math and a lot of science to be able to do. And so So these are respectable positions, but you can't believe that this is going to work if you don't think that the world is in a constant relationship with each other, that planets can affect people, and people also can affect planets. So the magic that you do in this world can also affect the stars. So essentially, it's this attitude that everything is interconnected in some way, and that therefore, if it can be influencing each other, then you can just utter subtler ways to influence things.
Right.
One thing that I find quite fascinating about sort of looking at magic in Latin American contexts specifically is that the word for it is often not like magic, but work. Because it's the same as like when you're sweeping the floor, that's a kind of work, you're cleaning up, right? But if you're cleansing yourself with herbs, that's just another form of work. You're just cleansing a different part of you. It's not a physical part, but it's a part that can be equally affected by dirt, except it's like spiritual dirt. It's like depression or anxiety or things that you feel are around you are actually just little entities you got to clean off of yourself and so on. So there's this idea, it's a natural thing, and not everyone considers it to be supernatural in the sense that it's not explainable by ordinary modes of cognition. Rather, the idea is that it's part of nature, we just haven't figured it out yet. So when I mentioned before natural magic as a category, a lot of it had to do, especially in the medieval and Renaissance eras in Europe, to figure out how this stuff works. How do we know for sure that let's say rue is a martial herb and not a solar herb? How do we know? We can examine its plant, we can see the structure of the leaves, we can see the stem and the way it grows, and these things seem like very martial characteristics. If it was solar, it'd be more like this. So it's this kind of like figuring out of how the world is connected, because if you know how it's connected, the idea is you can then manipulate it, right? If you make a bath with all these herbs that do particular things, let's say protection things, and you put it over yourself, or you make a charm bag and you hold it on you, the idea is that it'll protect you. Or you can have a talisman that's supposed to keep you safe from, let's say, arrows or swords, or bad luck, so you don't end up in a situation where someone is swinging a sword to your head. It's all about that's why I mentioned probability enhancement, right? It's the idea is that it's going to sway things in your favor because it'll put you in a particular alignment or a path to navigate situations better.
Very cool. I like the web that you were drawing there. And it's interesting to think about the herb math too, because what it sounds like is the attempt in doing something like that is, well, you have like a network of things in the world, and these networks all have various kinds of causes and effects on each other, such that if things are positioned in one way, that they will have a more or less, well, there will be like a biased probability distribution for a certain set of outcomes. So if you are aware of these things and how they're changing, and you identify, okay, it's probably time for me to like do an herb bath because things are not really going my way. Not only are you getting the effect of the herbs, but you're also sort of like bathing yourself through the nexus of cause and effect that is related to the entire web of things within the correspondences of those particular herbs.
It also depends on how you're getting them to do the thing. Is you want it to be, is it just because they're in the same location as each other, or is it because you're praying to a spirit to bind them together in the way that you want it to? Are you praying to the herbs themselves? For example, in one tradition that I recently come to study that comes from Brazil, you have to pray songs to every single herb. And then they come together, and then you ask them, because the herbs are thought to actually come in categories and kingdoms, and then you make them do the thing together. Or are you asking on a saint to do it for you? Are you asking a god? Are you charging it just by the power of psalm? A lot of Christian magic, as we'll talk about later, has to do with psalms being sung over things, and so on. So all of them have sort of, and is this psalm for cursing or protection? You can ally it with these particular things. Plants is one instance, but you can also have, again, a drawing of someone which you didn't stab, or you can have figurines or animal parts and so on, or even just the prayer itself. Some are just purely oral. You just recite it, and it's meant to work because of the names that are used and are spoken throughout the prayer.
So we know that there's a particular kind of metaphysics going on here that makes this work. And would you say that this is entirely incompatible with like contemporary scientific paradigmatic thinking, or is there just something that people are averse to? Maybe it does work a little bit better than we think with a sort of more mechanistic picture of reality.
Well, that's an interesting question, because with again, and people have problematized this idea of thinking things in terms of demonic or versus natural magic, but natural magic was considered almost a science. Some scholars who look at books about natural magic, like, figuring out the occult virtues present in the world, as a kind of early science, attempting to figure out, we don't categorize plants by planets anymore, or by star signs, but maybe that's just the way people did things back then, in air quotes. But the thing is like, it was considered to be figuring out how the world works, right? Not just guessing about it. So it was a real attempt to figure out, because if we know the way these things relate to each other, then we can affect reality in a different way. It's the same with astrology, right? Because the whole point of a lot of early astrology, and as well as Renaissance astrology, isn't to just kind of know, okay, well, this is the chart, and there's no winning against this fate. We just got to now avoid these circumstances as best as we can. It was very much the idea is like, well, we can influence it. We have to know what the problem is first, and then we can affect it by making talismans during better times and binding them to people so that this no longer affects you in the same way. If your chart tells you you're going to die in this way, well, let me make this healing talisman on a much better day when the stars are in a better position, and wear that on me all the time so it cancels each other out. So this was an attempt to kind of figure out, you use the word mechanistic, right? But it's in a way attempting to figure out a way that is not purely the way we think things go, right? But it's at the same time, there's a scientific impulse behind figuring out how things work together. On the other hand, I'm not fully up to date on sort of the research on like physics and so on, right? But there is. There's also different cultural attitudes towards what is considered real, right? In terms of like, when you say, for example, I'm suffering from this particular, let's say, illness, for example, in the village where I come from, people wouldn't immediately think, oh, you probably have a cold. People might think, well, are you fairy sick? Did you offend a fairy? Maybe you stepped on its favorite rock and you got to go make amends. You got to pour some milk on it, right? So it's just a different sort of a way of interpreting shared human experiences, right? So essentially, like, the question of is it scientific is almost, I think, a non-issue in a way, because it's not necessarily trying to do the same thing, right? It's trying to figure out answers to social questions, right, as well as physical ones, right? But through a different understanding of agency, right? That it's not just you and me who have agency, but the rocks have agency, invisible spirits have agency, and you're interacting with them whether you like it or not. So the idea is like, well, let's figure out what they are so we can interact with them better.
So it's more of an engineering problem than it is like an analysis explanation problem.
Maybe. Mm-hmm.
Cool. I wanted to get you to answer, or to provide some thoughts on that, because I think it's important to how people think about magic nowadays, which is often to internalize the polemic sort of use that you referred to initially. That's the thing that people who don't know what they're doing do, right? And that's an
We have the right religion, they have the evil sorcery.
Yeah, and then we go into psychology, and it's like, well, the magical thinking thing is like when you have delusions that could possibly be true, right? So it looks like we have instead a bunch of people who are just trying to approach reality in such a way that it more readily enables their ability to act in a way that they can, well, it's more will-driven, would be a term I would put it in. And later magical traditions, thelema is based on the Greek word for will. So there's a lot about agency, having a will, having that being carried out, and trying to mitigate influences that might be getting in the way. So having talked a bunch about what magic might be, how people have made sense of it, and all of that, let's go into the Christian stuff. So it's probably important, I think, to start any conversation about Christianity with the origins of it. I was sitting on some classes in an early Christian writings course, and I really liked the use of the term the Jesus movement to describe this. I think it's perhaps more accurate, and it gives you a better, broader picture of
the Jesus movement before it was a religion.
Right, and all of the various streams that went along in that. So can you give us some of the cultural context for the origins of this Jesus movement? Like, who are these Jesus movement people? How do they compare to the so-called pagan group of the time? What are the ideological differences at play there?
Right, so very quickly, this starts as a messianic movement within Judaism. There were a lot of different messianic people at the time, especially people who were claiming to be the Messiah or were interpreted to be the Messiah, And the idea was that because the Jewish groups were being really oppressed by the empires around them, you needed someone to liberate you as a political figure. It wasn't just like a religious figure in the traditional sense. This was someone who was going to very much liberate you from the oppression you were facing by the government. And so when the Jesus movement, as it were, arises, it coalesces around the figure of this person, Jesus of Nazareth, who is interpreted at first by some people as one of these revolutionaries, and hopefully he will win and for this battle for us and will be free. The issue is that he dies, right? So usually when one of these messianic figures dies, and there's many that come after him that also have failed messianic revolutions, the idea is like, okay, well that wasn't the real guy then, because he didn't liberate us, so we got to figure it out and go find someone else who's going to be this person for us. So if you have a lot of believers who think this person was the Messiah in a very different sense, a spiritual Messiah, someone who doesn't liberate us from our suffering in a worldly sense, but liberates our souls, right? That's the way to get around the problem of your Savior dying, because then you have it to be a cosmic Savior, a Savior who saves souls on a grand scheme of things. So you have this whole shift away from the political sort of idea to a much more spiritual sense of it. On the one hand, this means that him dying is not the end of the story. In fact, he comes back, right? So he's triumphed over an enemy much bigger than Rome or the emperor, which is death itself. And it means that it's also an apocalyptic movement. It's very much expecting the end to come very soon. Early Christians writing about Jesus, just maybe 70 years after his death, are expecting the second coming to come anytime, and for the world to essentially end, and everyone will be resurrected, their bodies will be remade, and then they'll go to heaven essentially. And so the question is then, what happens when he's not returning anytime soon? And you have the generation who was around at the time already having died. Their children now are hearing the story secondhand. And you have all these successive generations and so on. Of course, Constantine converts, and Christianity becomes the religion of the empire, which allows it to expand. But it's also a religion of salvation, right? It's not a religion like, if you're an Egyptian and you're born in Egypt, you're the Egyptian pagan. It's just the religion of your state. The relationship between the state and the religion is extremely independent. You can't just identify out of it necessarily, right? It's just you were born in a city that worshipped Thoth, and so that's kind of your guy, Same with Greece and so on. Whereas with Christianity, you're trying to help other people. You're trying to save other people's souls by convincing them this is the real way, and your gods are demons. They're actually fooling you. They're looking for all your offerings and your time and to lead you away from the truth. And so it becomes this mission of converting other people. And again, the other thing too is because it arises out of Judaism, most people who were Christians were Jews as well. And so they didn't see themselves as a new thing. They saw themselves as Jews who were following the real Messiah of Judaism. And so other Jews disagreed and said, this isn't the Messiah. We're going to stick around and wait for the real one. And so there became splinter groups, and so people became frustrated with not being able to convert as many of their brethren. And so they eventually started converting Greeks and other people around them. And so you get this trend towards figuring out how are we going to convert people who don't want to follow rabbinic law, who don't want to, get circumcised, who don't want to adhere to the dietary restrictions. So eventually laws get loosened, and, if you're a Gentile, you have different things to prescribe to. And if you're a Jew, then you have certain things that you have to follow and so on. That's a very, very rough and not at all complete answer to the question, but that's basically it's a restless time. It's extremely politically contentious. There's lots of groups who are trying to figure out who the real Messiah is, and the solve, for the death of Jesus is to make it about a cosmic journey, right? That he defeated death, so it doesn't really matter that he died to the Romans in a sense. What's more important that is that he's the king of the world who's going to redeem us all from death itself once we die.
A few interesting things stand out to me from this. So I also study philosophy. I've got a lot of familiarity with the philosophical context of the time. Some important things that I think to add to this narrative are how drastically different this attitude towards religion is.
Yeah,
because for the Jews, God picks you, and you probably don't want to be a Jew because it's really hard. And even to this day, there is efforts made to try to convince people to not convert in at least Orthodox circles. There's many more liberal reform styles of Judaism, but there's always been this underlying relationship between a chosen group and that particular deity. But then it moves out of that, and all of a sudden it's the thing that literally everybody needs to follow. Otherwise, they're all damned. And for the Romans, they have almost the opposite kind of framework.
Keep your gods, as long as you also pay, attention to Caesar or the emperor, you can have all your same gods, right?
Totally. And even further, I know Joe has a lot to say about this, but there's the idea that cosmic forces go by many names.
Yeah.
So something might have an essential nature as, say, Isis, but it might be called Athena or another name in other places. So these are all very different attitudes that are sort of at play in the cultural context. What was the one thing?
I forget the name of the person, but there was this really amazing writer in Greece right after Greece gets conquered by Rome, and they were writing about why did our gods fail us? Why didn't they protect us from Rome? And I wish I knew the name of it so I could tell you guys the source. But basically it's this letter that he writes, and he says, well, it's because they're more religious than we are. You see, they pray to their gods more. They sacrifice to them more. And the Roman army had little sections of it, which would be priests who would not pray to Roman gods, but would pray to the gods of the people they're conquering. So for example, they're coming into Greece. I'm going to pray to all of your gods and tell them, your people will still be free, technically. We're going to build them better roads. They're going to have a better quality of life and sanitation. And we're going to let you keep your temples. You're still going to get your offerings. You're still going to get your meats burnt, and stuff like that for you. The only difference, now hand your people over to us. Life will be better for them. And make sure as few of them die as possible in the conquering, And then you'll be happier. And we'll still let you be worshipped. They're just the only requirement will be that they have to also pay, offerings to the emperor. And so then this guy was writing that about this technique and thinking well, that's obviously why we lost, because they are more religious about our own gods than we are. We should have been going to temple more often. So it's a very interesting technique that acknowledges that all these things exist, right? It's just that obviously other nations have other gods that protect them, right? It's just that how do we then convince them to relinquish their people's state to a new power, right? It's well, let them still be worshipped.
I love that because it makes history sound more like the D&D campaign it's always been. And I'd love to see that come up in more Roman battle movies. You never see the priests on the outskirts chanting and giving offerings.
Yeah.
I think that's a disadvantage to all of us.
It gives them all +5 holy damage to their weapons. Yeah.
Right. Yeah. Some curses thrown out there, limbs breaking at random. Okay, so what do you think it is about the context? Okay, so it's Rome in particular that Christianity really starts to pick up, right? Paul, one of the initial proselytes of Christianity, goes over there and starts making his case. What is it about Roman culture that you think makes Christianity very much appealing to the people that are there?
Well, the thing, this is something that you can, write entire dissertations on. But I think that the gist of some of it, and again, there's many factors that go into this, but is that a lot of Romans were also just tired of the corruption that they were seeing within their government. And when your religion is linked to the government, there's a lot of, and especially when you're feeling unsatisfied, it's a lot easier to find something else appealing. Also because Christianity, so Christians in early Rome before it became the official religion were seen as weirdos. No one really cared that they existed. But it was just more they were antisocial because they weren't coming to the festivals. They weren't coming to leave offerings. They weren't taking part of the public life in the same way because they thought of it as essentially you might be contaminated by the pagans. So you had to go to your little church community, hang out with other Christians, and they would call each other brother and sister. And it was this very intimate, sort of loving environment of people who felt they were very oppressed and they wanted to stick together, essentially. And also, if you were converted and your parents weren't, then you weren't really talking to your parents anymore. So people were kind of weirded out by it. They thought it was a creepy cult, essentially. They just eat their own god. They're cannibals. It's kind of weird, So it's just this very uncomfortable attitude. But they weren't seen as dangerous, right? When they became when Christians were perceived as dangerous was when they were against the emperor, when they wouldn't give offerings to the emperor, and when they were seen as anti-political, right? So they became associated with any other radical group that was considered to be terrorist, essentially, like danger to the state. And especially, eventually edicts came out that, everyone has to go give an offering to the emperor. That's it. Just burn some incense and you're done. And you're going to get a slip of paper, essentially, that says that you did it. So you can show it to a guard and see, like, you cleared the thing, right? The problem is that now the question was, well, if we don't do this, we're probably going to be captured and tortured, because why are you against the emperor? You can have your little religion, you can practice it, it's fine, just as long as you also pay allegiance to the emperor. So then some Christians were like, well, maybe I'll still be Christian, but I just do this real quick and it's fine. But is my soul damned now because I'm also worshiping something that's not really a god, which is the emperor? On the other hand, some Christians were like, well, what if I bribe the people to give me the paper anyway? Because some did, right? They were like, well, I'll pay you, and then you say that I did it, but I didn't actually do it, But then that also might be a problem, right? Because maybe you shouldn't be acknowledging this government anyway, right?
Or lying.
Yeah. And so most, from what I understanding of what I've learned, most did this. Like, most either bribed them or just did it, But the few that didn't began to isolate themselves further and be like, no, we're the pure ones, we're the ones who stayed true, and we'll suffer together. And that's how, the cult of the martyrs was huge in early Christianity, because it became the sort of like the archetypal martyr, like Polycarp, who suffers greatly in the way that Jesus suffers. He mimics his wounds on his body. He gets pierced by a lance through his rib. Is this person who, in a way, is willing to endure the ultimate price for their living self, their body, to be broken and tortured in order for their spiritual salvation. Because again, their thinking is coming soon. Jesus is going to come back literally any day now. It could be tomorrow. So we don't want to have messed up by then. We don't know if we're going to get a second chance to be redeemed. And so martyrology, and in fact, there's some Roman judges who wrote, like, these guys are coming in trying to get killed. Like, they're coming in and, like, very much, hey, just so you know, I didn't pay the emperor. Just so you know, I actually, totally didn't do these things I'm supposed to do. Are you going to capture me? And so the question is, it's like, and these guys are like, go away. I'm not going to kill you. Like, you're obviously asking for it because you want to become a martyr,
Right.
And so basically, like, but Romans as well were dissatisfied with different elements of the Roman Empire. And also being a Christian, still because of the saints, allowed you to still have the local mini gods, as it were, like, who are specialists. Like, this one protects blacksmiths, and this one protects warriors, and this one has healers, because saints could take over that role. And that was a major thing that helped Christianity spread, is because people who are like, I'm not going to give up the goddess, no thank you, I quite like her, and nothing that you're giving me is going to solve the problem. So it's a good news, we have Mary. Mary is the mother of God. So you get to, like, replace these entities with something that does functionally a very similar role. And then also you get a religion that's based on love, in a way that it's not necessarily, and again, we can go into this a bit later, but like God actually loves you and cares about you deeply as a person and wants your salvation, which is very different than, cowering in fear of gods, and also in gods being more like distant paternal figures or emperors and kings who can get pissed off at you at any moment, and can send lightning bolts and so on. Whereas Jesus, as this intimately human figure who is also divine and provides an afterlife salvation that's a lot nicer than being in Hades, and just kind of being a wandering soul, or at best a hero who gets venerated as a mini god themselves.
Right. So there's not a lot of hope for the lay people, you could say.
Yeah, because your hope is that your emperor prospers, right? Because he becomes the main figure and that's the main political head. Whereas this speaks to every single person, especially people who are poor and disenfranchised and are oppressed. Blessed are the meek, right? Instead of the rich and the boastful and so on. So you get this entire thing that privileges the very people who are most oppressed and who often have the least amount of voice in a traditional religious kind of society, where all they can do is just scrounge up a few coins for offerings every month, right?
Right. So we can see the very literal reasons for why Nietzsche later called these kinds of
Nietzsche,
slave morality.
Yeah, slave morality, and seeing it as something that only the weak would really do, and it's corruption of brave pagan morals, that kind of thing. Yeah.
Right, yes. Yeah. Oh man, that's a line of argument in itself.
Yeah, genealogy of morals, yeah. Mm-hmm.
So maybe we'll get there. I want to try
Yeah.
to see if we can stay historically consistent.
Mm-hmm.
Now, I was reading something by a guy, his name is Dave Martin. I'm sure you might have heard his name, or not. He's a professor at Yale, and he has a book about the creation of the New Testament.
Mm-hmm.
And in it, one part that I thought was interesting is how he mentions the relationship between the people of the time and like what we would consider magic.
Mm-hmm.
So casting curses, for example, would be very common. Somebody
Mm-hmm.
slights
Oh, yeah.
you, and so you like bury a doll underneath their
Mm-hmm.
particular walking point and hope that it infects their being with bad luck and such.
Mm-hmm.
So in Rome and Greece, etc., at the time, we have lots of just magical cycles of attack and
Oh, yeah.
defense.
Mm-hmm.
People are just volleying magic from across the city.
Mm-hmm.
That's normal life. But Christianity gives you a escape from that. It tells you that if you cleave to this one particular being, to put it in the language of mystics, that you will be elevated from these lower forces. You have to follow the thing that is transcendent of all, and thus you will also be sort of brought into all of the gifts that that transcendent being has to offer. So do you think this defense against the magical cycles of attack and defense of the time was also appealing to people?
Perhaps that's also a Neoplatonic concept, right? Because in Neoplatonism, you also have the idea that you can pick a deity that you resonate very much with and cleave to them and join their train. It's like they're in chariots, you know. And when you die, instead of going to whatever place, you can actually join their troop and kind of follow that particular deity, right? So that was also a major influence on Christianity, right? And so, in fact, Neoplatonists were like one of the main contenders against Christians in a sense, because on the one hand it was if Greek pagans could keep their gods but have all the benefits that they're seeing in Christianity, they wouldn't bother converting. So they had to kind of levy new sort of polemics against them. But the thing is like, you know how they often say like, oh, well, history is written by the victors or the rich, you know, people who had the time and the money to, one, be literate and two, write about themselves, which very few people had, you know. We know a lot actually about what regular people were doing because of curse tablets, like lead tablets that you would draw on, like, this judge better grant me my, you know, case so that I win, and you bury it inside of courthouses. Greek courthouses are littered with these. Like, people have been excavating them for a long time. There's endless these lead tablets that go, I don't know, name, son of name, you know, that's my dad, you know, demand this, and this god will subjugate this judge, and the lawyer's tongue will be tied so he cannot speak against me, and he's going to suffer, you know, and the person who's the witness against me is not going to show up because he's going to be sick, you know, and I'm going to win, you know. So you can see what people were worried about. A lot of them have to do with marriage, a lot of them have to do with love, making people get, you know, having the right person fall in love with you, or essentially cursing other people. So, and you get all these like little wax dolls with the pins through them, which is quite fascinating. Some love spells, as we might talk about later, very much like torture spells, even within Christianity. But the general gist of it is that it's easy to kind of think, okay, well, if you have an escape from this, right, you know, this is you're not gonna have to worry about this stuff anymore. But even within any new movement that starts to think that way, they instantly become concerned when bad things happen to them anyway. So, for example, you know, baptism, the first major ritual of Christianity as it developed, was thought to have essentially purified someone's soul to the point where they are now sealed. There's a seal over you, and no sin's going to penetrate you anymore. But what happens when the guy you just baptized cheats on his wife, or lies, or maybe says something nasty to someone, or shows jealousy in their heart? You know, did the baptism work? So there became new ways to kind of answer that. You can confess, you can, you know, get penance, and so on. So there was these new rituals adopted to get people to essentially fix and keep their baptismal seal intact, right? So the baptism question didn't actually answer the fact that people were still kind of nasty people. They were still humans afterwards, right? So then the same thing comes with magic, you know, is like, yes, maybe, you know, you can think that angels or God or Jesus will protect you from things, but what happens when bad luck happens to you anyway? What happens once you find a lead tablet on your property and you start to feel kind of sick and you're worried, is that it? Is that what happened? Was it the tablet? Am I making myself worried? Am I, you know, what's going on? Is it still working? You know, so it comes, well, there's new answers to it right now. Of course, like I mentioned in the beginning, you know, one person's magic can be another person's religion and vice versa. So, you know, burning a candle and praying to a saint, going into their tomb, which was very popular in early Christianity, rubbing the oil from the lamps in the tomb on yourself, you know, or trying to get the bones of the saint. You know, like you probably all heard of relics, right? You know, getting their toe bones or their fingers, or trying to, like, the idea is that this bone, just like how you can use someone's hair to curse them or to do something to them, you know, this bone from the saint is holy because this saint is holy, right? You know, and the saint is now in heaven, but their material body somehow is still connected to that heavenly essence. So now if I have this on me, it'll protect me and shield me. So this becomes new amulets, right? New talismans. They're just not pagan anymore, right? But that's kind of why I mentioned early on the reason a lot of like scholars talk about ritual specialists, because that way when you have a priest turning wine into blood, and let's say a random sorcerer turning a bunch of herbs in a bowl of water into a magical bath, it's not seen as functionally that different. It's a transformation of a unity of parts that becomes something else and now have an effect on people in a different way, without it being the prejudice of, well, this one is real religion and this one is just some random sorcery and whatever. Yeah.
I like that a lot for a few reasons. So this perspective that I had given, it seems like it's prioritizing more the history of theologians as opposed to like the history of people doing their practice in everyday reality. And it's interesting that if you give people something where you're like, look, you don't have to pay attention to magic anymore, this is a potential way out, here you go, that people will just like naturally gravitate towards doing that anyways. That the natural human mode of processing for luck and for sin, it's now called, or bad action, is interpreted in terms of like very much a poetical kind of frame. There's a filmmaker, his name is Jodorowsky, and he has a great book. This is very relevant for the Jungian theme of the event, because that's why we're all here, is because of the Jungian society. So Jodorowsky's got a great book, it's called Psychomagic, and he says that basically, have you read?
Yeah, and also his tarot one.
Yeah, he's such a weird person.
I know.
I love this guy. But so he says that the essence of magic is like in the poetic act, or at least insofar as it works on people's minds.
It does have a logic to it, but it's a logic of poetry, like allegory and metaphor, as opposed to very direct sort of. Yeah.
Like a rhyme is a sympathy.
Yeah.
For example. And so I think this example is really interesting that you give of people, well, they have this option of being sealed with baptism. I didn't know that. That's actually interesting, that they thought that it would seal your heart against sin. But even so, people still end up going into a graveyard at night and rubbing oil all over their face and like stealing dead pieces of people because they're like, you know what?
It's like,
I just need to live this piece of theater so that everything will be okay.
Well, that's the thing too, and they didn't see it as non-religious. It was like, well, it's very Christian, right? These are saints, these are holy men, right? And now I can be closer to them, because the idea is like, that's also why a lot of prayers are to saints to pray for you in certain ways, because the idea is like, well, God will hear it if it's the saint saying it. Will he hear it if I say it? So even though it's this economy of everyone can be saved and everyone can have an equal connection to God through Jesus and the Holy Spirit, there's still this question of, well, the saints are special, right? The saints have, and their lives are full of excess, right? Extreme torture and adventure and weird things that happen to them. They're just completely out of the ordinary. These are weird mythic beings, right? You have Saint Christopher, who shows up with a dog's head sometimes, and he's a giant who speaks a weird language, and he carries little Jesus on his shoulder, and it gets heavier and heavier as he goes across the river, right? These are weird, interesting stories, but they're the whole idea, or like saints who have these weird torture sequences where like they cannot be killed by fire or by lashing or whatever, and finally when they're pierced, their blood puts out the fire, and they just go to heaven because they're like, it's time now,
Very cool. Okay, so that's getting my mind running on the thought of these saints. Can you give me your 3 strangest saints, excluding the one you mentioned with the dog head? Okay,
because that's really cool. He has a dog head. So I would be remiss to not mention my guy that I study, Cyprian of Antioch, because his hagiography is basically like, this guy was the coolest magician who ever lived. He initiated into every single secret society and mystery cult, and he went to Egypt, and he learned Chaldean astrology, and he was too late for that. He was like, dedicated to Apollo by his parents. He was born and into this beautiful lineage and so on. He learned necromancy and sorcery and enchantment, and then he goes to Antioch in modern-day Turkey, in Pisidia, and becomes a sorcerer for hire, right? And people start buying his services. Now, eventually, one person is like, hey, I'm really in love with this girl. She's a Christian virgin, so she's not going to be with me, but can you do some, sorcery on her, and then we can get together? And he's like, yeah, this is no problem, whatever, just a girl, And everything he throws at this woman fails, because all she does is cross herself. And that repels all the demons. And of course, they are demons, not pagan gods, right? Because this is a Christian story. And he does it 3 times, and she repels everything. And eventually he realizes, like, okay, so everything I learned just does nothing against her. I want to do what she's doing. So he converts to Christianity. Now, and then eventually becomes a bishop, and both he and Justina die under the rule of Emperor Diocletian. 4th century, so they're both beheaded. Now, here's the thing, right? That story is obviously a polemic, right? This is telling all of you pagans out there who think you might be cooler than me or not, because everything that you have, all your best techniques, they're going to fail against one girl who crosses herself, right? Like, big whoop, not very impressive. So it's obviously a polemic. It's also, Cyprian is kind of coded to be possibly Iamblichus, the Neoplatonic philosopher, because he was a major opponent of Christianity in a sense, because people who followed him were very interested in, like, wait a second, I don't have to convert at all. I can just have my cool Greek philosophy. Now, the thing is there's an underground tradition that Cyprian converted just so he can keep doing his magic, because he's like, this is a weird little mystery cult. I want to know this thing too. And so the idea that he burned all his books of demons upon converting, there's this idea that he saved one of them, and so a lot of books in Europe claim to be the original one. And so that's, other two, I think Marin of Antioch is very cool as well. I don't know, I like Antioch saints apparently.
Can I just comment on one thing?
Yeah,
because I'm going to forget this by the end.
No,
go
ahead.
It's funny, like the symbolic act of burning books, that's just a symbol. And like, especially like at that time, books were very hard to come by, and people were like constructing memory palaces and memorizing like literally everything that people could know about the universe at that time. So like, he probably just remembered it all.
Oh yeah, he still knew his shit. And then so the other thing, so Marina, she's she's born to pagan parents, converts to Christianity. I think because one of her like the woman who was taking care of her, like a babysitter essentially, was a Christian in secret and taught her Christianity. So this guy falls in love with her, this like wealthy Roman man. Or a politician, I forget exactly which. Anyway, so he like wants to marry her. She rejects it because she wants to be like Justina, a pious virgin. And so she's sentenced to essentially be tortured and killed. But nothing works on her. Nothing can affect her body. Eventually, a dragon shows up and eats her, and she exits his body like out of his stomach, like a C-section almost, like basically because she signed herself with a cross or wore a cross that irritated him. Then the devil shows up, and this is the best part because it's not cool enough yet. The devil shows up and she beats him with a hammer. So like who needs magical knives and crosses? She just took a hammer and just, I don't know, beat his ass,
All you need is God and a hammer.
Yeah, and then eventually she goes to heaven, right, when she dies. And
because she beat up the devil.
Yeah, it's like, okay.
Yeah, what's he gonna do? Come back?
Yeah. There's, and the third, I think, there's so many like early interesting Christian saints. I like Polycarp, Felicitas. Another, I mentioned Christopher. I think another cool one in general is just this, well, there's so many different archetypes of weird saints in the area, and especially Mediterranean versus when you get to like the saints who were kind of gods low-key, but then were made into saints, like we talked about earlier before this began about St. Bridget, But in general, it's like anytime you see a need being fulfilled socially, because we talked about the social implications of the world of spirits and the world of agencies that are interacting with each other. So if you can't have your god anymore, you need something to fill that role, right? Which can often become a saint. So I would say like fun ones like, Bridget or saints like Polycarp, this early martyr, who again was not considered a saint technically, but was a martyr, but who became a saint later on, who became a model for Christian behavior and how to like suffer essentially oppression, But the idea that like nothing can hurt you. So what happens if you're oppressed and you do get hurt by the guards or whatever like that, or to torture, Well, what's being hurt? It's your body, but is it really you? Are you your body? So this becomes this dualism that my soul is clean and impenetrable. And if anyone's read Plato's Apology, there's actually a very similar line of thinking there. That Plato says, you can kill me. Sorry, Socrates. Plato writing as Socrates says, you can kill me, fine. You can poison me with hemlock and I'll die and whatever, but you can't kill me. That's not me that you're hurting. My soul is eternal and it's going to live past my death. So this begins this early thinking that, souls survive their death and are immortal, and your real identity is your soul. The body that you have is an accident, because also within a lot of Platonism is this idea of reincarnation, right? That you could have been an animal or a different person from before. So is that really you, or is you the thing that goes between them, right? That stays consistent, as opposed to the mere accident that you happen to be born in this time period and in this body.
So in the animal example of the reincarnation, do you know much more about that? Do you want to comment?
What, for Plato?
Yeah, I know Plato doesn't really talk about the mechanisms too much.
I know, and also Plotinus is a little bit about it too.
Yeah, he just kind of accepted.
Yeah.
Plato says it, so
so it's there. It's the case. Yeah. Basically, well, there's this idea that it's also tied to morality in a sense of like if you're a really good person, you become something, you can liberate yourself from the chain of reincarnation. Whereas if you give in to your base instincts, if you this is metaphor of the chariot. Your wisdom or reason is being pulled by the passions, and by the appetites. And so the question is, what are you following? Are you like an animal that's just following the appetites for sex, for food, passions like anger or sadness, or are you settling on reason, which is what makes you uniquely human that other animals don't have? If you follow your passions, you might end up becoming either a very base person or an animal. But as you follow your reason, you can, which has nothing to do with the body, it's not that it's an independent thing, it's what controls your mind essentially, is you can move apart from it. So that's the very quick and dirty way of phrasing it. But essentially that's kind of the way it works. And then you also have the idea that some people who are so awful can come back as plants, because the only thing a plant can do is worship the sun. And the sun is the metaphor for God, essentially, or the good, So the only thing it can do is photosynthesize, look at the sun.
Right.
So then eventually, now you're forced to really remember what your goal is, which is to remember the good and remember the way you are embodying that, and then eventually go forward.
I kind of like that better than a picture of something like hell, because you basically just have no choice but to accumulate merit, because you're locked into a space where you can only worship goodness and only engage in contemplation. So that's kind of nice. You end up as a plant, worst case scenario, but all that plant can do is become better than it was before.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, so back on track to the magic stuff.
Mm-hmm.
All right, so let's say 1st to 3rd century, what does Christian magic look like? And I'll contextualize that by saying I want to sort of get a picture of the evolution of Christian magic.
Right, yeah. So this is also all information that is completely contingent on what survives. As fragments of papyri, whatever like that, and things that when we, in the absence of papyri, lead tablets and seeing things like that, or amulets, little scraps of paper or clay that have, designs on them and words of power and so on, So early, you could say the early phase of it, resembled very much the earlier Greek magic. If anyone has heard of it, the PGM, the Greek Magical Papyri, they're a collection, essentially a sorcerer's recipe book, that includes everything from long prayers to gain an angel that will protect you forever and do everything for you. Basically the coolest butler that lives, And then you have...
Butler.
No, it's really... So it is a list and a spell of the things this thing can do for you. It can give you money, it can give you fame, it can give you women, it can give you anything you want, right? And then also there's this one part where it just says, slight aside, it can lift you into the sky and launch you into the ocean, which is really funny. Because I was like, if this thing can literally make you rich, why would you ask to be just yeeted into the ocean? Well, we don't know. But anyway, so maybe he had midterms and he was just not feeling it.
Yeah, enough.
Yeah, but then there's also little things basically quick dream incubation so that I dream of who my lover will be, or this really quick curse tablet to bind someone, and so on. Or you have these love spells in air quotes because it's more like torture, inflame her heart, pierce her mind, string her by her eyelashes and her hair, may she feel for me between her hair to her toenails, which is a lot worse than head to toes in my opinion. That's just grosser.
Man,
and then you have
BDSM is intense.
yeah, and all this stuff inflame her so she can't sleep, and so she just whinnies like a dog and brays like a cow, whatever like that. All these gross metaphors to essentially destroy someone, right, until they have to consummate this, and let her have no rest until she is with me, right? That stuff is all in Christian magic too, except you're changing the names of what you're petitioning, right? So instead of, let's say, a god, now it's an angel or a saint. So in this collection, Ancient Christian Magic, Coptic Texts of Ritual Power, there's an 11th century papyrus. It's a fragment, I believe it's 13 pages long, so it's not too big. And the whole thing is essentially the same thing I just mentioned, right? So except you are reciting it as Cyprian. You are Cyprian of Antioch, and you're saying, long ago I was a sinner. I was, awful and separated from God, and I worshipped the great dragon, and I suckled milk from his right teat, or whatever like that. It's this long description of how he was the sinner, and then it goes into and he put a crown on my head with his jewel, and then it says, but I found salvation in Jesus, in only him, and then long pause. Anyway, because I'm so holy now, bring this woman to me, except it's not Cyprian talking, it's you talking, right? So you say, I, N, name, son of, I guess, your father's name, demanded this woman and daughter of N. submits to me, and all the same gross metaphors of how you're basically torturing this person, and except it's saying like, Gabriel, archangel, you who were the bearer of good news, as you told Mary, you must now, tell this woman she has to be with me, or else I will deny you worship, I will not revere you, I will like spit on your name, you will not have a place in heaven, the virgin will not take you in her arms, God will leave no place for you.
Damn.
It's really intense. You're basically like threatening an archangel, right? That if you don't let this woman sleep with me, or it's a very rapey metaphor, right? But basically like you're gonna really like suffer. So who are you to boss around an angel, right? Well, obviously the only person who can do that is God. And so there's this identification between the salvation of Cyprian, who you are now basically role-playing as, and your salvation as a Christian, and then your authority to boss around these other spirits, which is essentially a very pagan attitude. Because in a lot of pagan traditions, you can basically boss around gods by denying them sacrifices and threaten to deface their statues and so on, So basically what I'm trying to say is it's not that different from like Greek magic at the time in general for Greek gods, It's often about changing things to be saint narratives or to really play into the authority that you gain from being a Christian, right? So for example, like, in pagan forms, you can have authority by, one, I guess you could say bullying a god. You can also have authority by being a priest. You can have authority by being someone who's initiated in a mystery tradition, or someone who's very trained and learned. Like someone who's a great poisoner would know a lot about how to curse people, and so on and so forth. So then, but the authority here is a metaphysical authority that comes from being saved, right? So because you are closer, you have access to this higher level of power that commands everything beneath it, right? You have Pseudo-Dionysius ranking the angels and basically fixing paganism by being like, well, they're maybe not demons, maybe the pagan gods are just angels, but we just didn't know them by the right names, and now we can worship them properly because we know they all bow to Jesus anyway.
Well, that's great.
Yeah, so that didn't catch on. But it did catch on in a lot of grimoires, though, which we can talk about later. But basically, like, a lot of this is matching that hierarchy, except you have this greater understanding that there's this pool of power you can tap into, right? And that power is being a saved Christian.
So what really is the most interesting to me out of all of this is this role-play aspect.
Oh, yeah.
And so I realized, so I wanted to mention this more clearly in case it wasn't clear before, but a sympathy is something that's like things that are in wave or in coordination with each other. They're not necessarily the same, but they do operate in a harmony.
Yes.
So like a musical note, a harmony would be the perfect example for a sympathy. Two things that complement each other, that have a relationship, that if you change one of them, the relationship would be fundamentally different. But the universe is supposed to work according to a bunch of harmonies, and of course we have the ancient notion of the harmony of the spheres. That,
yes, precisely,
the ancient world, the spheres themselves are precisely singing in such a way that they produce a particular kind of harmony. So harmony versus discord would be the good metaphor for sympathetic versus non-sympathetic components of reality.
And then you have the imitative, right? Like the doll is the person, the wax figure. Okay, so that's the other thing. I mentioned like curses and love spells are often similar in this kind of genre of magic. Like a curse you can see is like, you have these figurines, these wax dolls or clay dolls that are pierced with nails, right? There's a really famous one, I believe, somewhere in Rome, I forget the exact place. It comes from, the collection I know it from is Geiger's book. It's like ancient cursing tablets or something like that. It's a cool compilation of these things. And you have a doll that's pierced with these nails, but their nails are made of copper. Copper is a Venusian metal. Venus rules love. And you're actually saying, prick her heart so she only thinks of me. Prick her mind so she only thinks of me, right? Because it's associated with a spell that you read out loud, right? So this is one of the very rare cases where we see a spell that's written and we also know what the physical artifact of it is supposed to look like. Because the spell tells you what to do with it. It says make a doll, fashion it in the shape of a woman, and pierce it with these nails, But we actually found someone who literally did this. It's not just a random book that, a collection of papyri, and we don't know if anyone ever did this. But we can be like, oh, wow, someone actually really did this because the doll even has the words on it that accompany the spell. So, and it looks like a curse, but it's a love spell, right? Well, again, considering the rapey undertones of a lot of these things, is it really a love spell or is it more of a curse? Yeah, it's a love curse, right? But the idea is you're subjugating this person's will to be bound to you, right? And so, and there are female versions of this, by the way, because if you're a widow and no one wants to marry you, and you're broke, and you are basically the lowest member of society because you don't have a man who's, standing in for you and being, like, you need to get married quickly. And what happens if no one wants to marry you because you're a widow, right? So it's like, well, it's time to pick some guy with money and start pricking that doll, right? So anyway, so that was often an escape from like social oppression and so on. But my so that's sort of the imitative side of things that also, of course, has a relationship with the sympathetic one.
Right. That relationship is exactly what I wanted to point out, because in the act of imitating another person through the role play, it's like you're generating in yourself a sympathy of that person's soul.
Right, that if I do it to this thing that looks like them, it's going to affect this real person.
Totally. Like if you imagine hitting a gong and then that gives off a sound wave, but you're the kind of gong that can mold how it's shaped so that the sound waves that emanate off of it are different. Well, that's exactly what you're doing in this
And
example.
it's not going to affect a different woman, right? It's specifically this one.
Right. So that's cool. I like that. Really relates to that poetic act stuff that we were talking about. And a lot of magic is very theatrical, you know.
So if you guys remember when I mentioned like the side of like figuring out the occult virtues of the world, or figuring out, you know, which plants belong to this planet, or, you know, what which animals are related to which sort of beings and so on. You know, why is this animal associated with this god? You know, a similar thing happens with like early grimoires, like the Testament of Solomon, which is, you know, King Solomon was considered to be a mage in many traditions, and that he bound these demons to build his temple. And essentially like enslaved them because he got a ring from Michael, the archangel, who taught him like, this is how we can boss them around. So it's an interesting idea that demons can be productive in a way. They're not necessarily, I mean, they're evil in scare quotes, but they can be mobilized to do good things by being bossed around essentially by higher powers, which is again how a lot of earlier Greek, Egyptian, Roman understandings of spirit hierarchies work, right? That you can, lower daemons can be manipulated by providing their boss. So in a lot of like Greek magical papyri spells, you'll notice that like every name under the sun is chanted. You're naming like Egyptian gods, Greek gods, Hebrew names of power, Hebrew names for the, you know, God in general. So it's like, why are all these things in the same place? It's kind of like a shotgun shell approach, right? You know, let's say like a, you know, shooting a single bullet is you're going right to the heart of like who, you know, the spirit obeys Poseidon, so you're telling Poseidon to move that thing. Let's say you don't know what spirits are listening to you, or you don't know who they obey, and you live in a very multicultural world like Alexandria, you know, and you're thinking, I'm just going to fire off everything and hope one of them lands. And the spirit goes like, not that one, I don't care about him, whatever. Oh, yeah, okay, never mind, I gotta go. Like that, you're right, you know. So that sort of understanding of hierarchies is key to a lot of Christian magic, because the idea is certain demons have certain angels that rule them. So in the Testament of Solomon, you have like, this demon is ruled by Gabriel, this demon is ruled by Raphael, you know. So if you want that demon to do something for you, you have to go to Raphael and be like, hey, you who rule this demon, do this. And that also exists in like Egyptian magic, but the decans. So like, you know, you have your 12 zodiacs, each one can be divided into 3, and each phase of the zodiac as it moves throughout the sky is a phase of a decan. And so there's 36 in total. And so you can be like, this deacon rules this thing, so I need you, and you're going up the hierarchy. You mentioned spheres, right? So it's like you have this, let's say, angel or spirit that rules this, right?
You can draw if you want, by the way, if that would help.
No, I think I'm good, but
Okay.
maybe I will a bit later once we're finished. But like, so this, you know, thing rules that. Then you have the planet that rules that spirit, and then you have the celestial body, like let's say stars or deacons, that rules that, and so on and so forth. So you're going up the hierarchy. So if something's not working, you can just keep going up and keep calling everyone else's manager until someone picks up and actually forces that guy to do something for you, right? So this idea is that we have this world permeating with demons. We can't get rid of them, okay, fine. Like, let's say all the pagan gods are just demons. Well, how are we going to boss them around if we want them to do something for you? Because maybe the angels have better things to do than help you out, unless apparently you're Cyprian. You can just get Gabriel to get you a lady friend. But the thing is like you have, okay, fine. Well, let's mobilize something closer to Earth, because there's also this idea that the higher up you go, the less dense things are. So dense being material, right? The most dense is something that's living, or like this table or me, you know. But there's parts of me or you that are not dense. These are the spirit parts. So how can we mobilize things that can work the world in an easier way? So a demon might struggle less than an angel to cause a certain effect, because they're closer to us. They're closer to the earth. They're considered chthonic, under the world, underground, you know. Whereas celestial bodies, they can do great big sort of projects that affect wide ranges of things, like politics or shifting the landscape in certain ways, but maybe they don't really care if you find $500 on the ground or gold or whatever like that, you know. So that's kind of the idea. So often like early grimoires are very much about bossing demons around, and that goes up to the Goetia we mentioned before. It goes into the Grimorium Verum, all these like later, you know, 16th, 17th century Christian manuals of magic that involve you being pure. So again, we talked a bit before, you know, about you having been saved. So, but also you being pure in the sense of you're fasting, you're abstaining from sex, you're not polluting yourself. You are actually praying a lot fervently every day to basically cleanse yourself. You wear linen that's been washed and you smell nice and everything like that. So, and then you're ready to summon a demon, and you do it by forcing it and binding it in the names of God and the names of all these angels that rule them and so on, right? And then the demon shows up and you get it to do the thing that you want it to do. And so you get these long lists of spirits and what they can accomplish, right? Testament of Solomon is a very, very early example. But you get, these demons that can do things the way that they did things for Solomon. Now, of course, the question then becomes, how can you assure that they will actually carry it out? That's the other side of it. It's not just the angel or the spirit bossing them. It's also making sure they don't lie to you. So like a lot of like the invocations to like summon demons and a lot of these like medieval and Renaissance grimoires, a lot of it is related to like make sure a demon doesn't lie to you, because it's not going to want to do the job, right? The last thing it wants is to, I don't know, teach you astronomy or mineralogy or liberal arts or whatever it is a demon can do. So it's going to try and find a way to get out of it. So you got to basically make sure it's telling you the truth. It's also making sure that it's the real thing showed up and not one of its servants. Because then demons also have legions of spirits that fall under them. So it's all these little hierarchies that get more narrow and narrow. And so all of this is related to the idea of hierarchy, authority, purity, and none of it is complete. Like, again, this exists in a Christian context, but none of it is that unique. A lot of it has to do with earlier attitudes towards the way you control and interact with these other agencies that are, my advisor John Marshall calls them non-obvious beings, in the sense that they are beings that have agency in the world, but they're not immediately obvious to the physical senses. So these are spirits or angels and so on. So it's an economy of trust and bartering that often relates to the way that you force a slave to do something, or that you pay someone to do something for you with like offerings or bribes and so on. Or you call the general of this guy to discipline this guy.
So one thing that is interesting about this picture that you're painting, that's very much the sort of horror stereotype, or the edgy black metal band stereotype of religion, or at least that's where it's coming from, with the symbols of Solomon, grimoire magic, circles appealing to hierarchies of demonic beings, etc. So what's funny to me is that even the most, quote, demonic kind of magic does come from Christianity, and you could conceive of it as a Christian kind of magic, because it couldn't exist in that form without the Christian context.
And some of them don't actually relate to Jesus or don't talk about Christianity per se, it's just Hebrew god names as well.
Right.
But they exist in that monotheistic sort of frame of mind.
Mm-hmm.
Which is also interesting because some grimoires are literally, you can do this if you're a priest. It assumes you're a priest. So it's expecting not only that you're a Christian or a religious person, but that you've undergone a particular level of training that is not necessarily the average Joe is going to do, right?
So I see why how do you say it again?
Dionysius?
Yeah. I see how he fits into this now. Because he's got this thing where the celestial hierarchies map onto the ecclesiastical hierarchies, so that the church itself connects you to this system of supernatural authority. So that's very interesting. I didn't know that about having to be a priest. So like the laity, they wouldn't be
Some
able
of them,
to, or...
there's, everyone is going to find a way around it, right? Even like illiterate people who happen to find a paperback grimoire is going to be like, well, this isn't going to stop me. I'm going to incorporate the symbols in it then too. Everyone's going to start taking technology where they
but
can.
they can maybe kind of improvise with it.
Yeah. But like there are some things that very much are expecting that you have access to priestly equipment, because they'll say, wear the vestments of a priest, where are you going to find those, or consecrate these items at a mass. So like the tools, the daggers, and the things that you actually are using in the ritual, you need to get them prayed over and blessed at a mass. So there's this like interesting sort of thing where people would sometimes have a basket, magic tools at the bottom, blanket over them, nice little statues or figurines or books at the top, It's like, please bless this thing for me, right? And it's actually, the blessing is somehow permeating through the blanket and hitting the real tools, so you can trick the priest to doing it for you.
It's like, please bless my baby.
Yeah, people became very crafty with it, right? And there's after the Franco-Italian sort of bibliothèque bleue, like the blue genre of grimoires, which are paperbacks, which means ordinary people could own them. They were banned. It was considered like a secular crime to own them, as well as a religious sin. But then you had like priests who would own these and be like, oh yeah, like I'm liking this, right? The other hand too is you have monks who had the time to learn Latin and also to like read and to spend all their times in a monastery, would have libraries full of these things, and they would do it, I guess there's not a better way to spend a Friday night, than summoning a demon in a monastery. But the idea is also that you are participating in a hierarchy that strengthens your faith in a way, because you can boss demons around. But you're also maybe, who knows, trying to redeem the demon or trying to figure out a way to like make it serve God instead of doing whatever it's doing in hell.
Right. I want to follow up on that in a second, but I want to fill some historical gaps. So the period we're talking about with the grimoire magic and the people doing the covert blessings, the priests, the vestments, all this. You mentioned Middle Ages and Renaissance.
Yeah.
That's key for this period?
Yeah, and then the paperbacks come in 17th, I think 18th, 19th centuries, especially when they get to the New World and it becomes even more complicated. But you get a lot of them floating around, like, this is painting with extremely broad strokes, but like France, Italy, Spain, Portugal gets a lot of paperback ones, where common people are having access to them. They're hiding them, they're using them in different ways. You get folk magicians, like, or charm, like conjurers and different aspects of cunning folk using them. In like Sweden and Norway, for example, you have these elaborate, leather-bound, beautiful, expensive tomes, and the grimoires are very much for the upper class because, and you can tell by what the spells are for too. So like, is the spell is for like how to make my bullet shoot straight, how to make my officer promote me to become the next rank in my military, or how to get this duke to like me, Whereas with some of the ones in Iberia, for example, it's how to find treasure in the ground. Because like this idea, like the Moors left treasure in Spain, that was kind of just myth, right? And we could go find them, but the treasure is haunted by jinn, and how do we dispel them? Well, like we have to use our own magic to counter that, But I mean, again, not everyone perceived that as being magic. People just thought as, well, what's different? Well, how is it so different from praying to a saint to help me, I don't know, not starve, right?
Right. Yeah, I think that is important to emphasize as well. So like in Judaism, you have tons of stuff in the original law, like in Exodus, where for example, a man is cured of leprosy. In order to make them ritually pure, you have to take 2 doves, cut one's throat over a bowl of, I think it's fresh water, and then sprinkle the other dove with the blood of the other one, and then let it go, and then with it flies the evil.
Yep.
Which is identical to like magical rituals to expel some sort of disease or force that are found like all over the world.
Yeah, or like
Right.
the sympathetic thing of transferring properties. So like, again, even like there's to this day in my grandmother's village in Eastern Europe, you have this idea like if someone's sick, you can pass stones over them, which will take the tumor or the blister out of you. You throw in a river that flows west, and it'll take it with you to the setting sun. As the sun sets, this illness is leaving you as the sun leaves this world, right? Or like rubbing a chicken all over you, and the chicken's gonna get the illness instead of you, and so on. And then you let it run into the forest, and it'll take it somewhere else.
The important thing being though in the Judeo-Christian traditions is like source. Who's the authority giving you this command?
And that's the thing too.
So
It's like
divinely ordained acts.
So, with respect to this, is a big question that happens in a lot of like Christian magic context, which is where's the power coming from, right? Because you want to make sure it's not coming from a demon. That's the main anxiety. So, what happens when you have a really aggressive spell that looks kind of nasty, like the Cyprian one, the erotic spell? The whole and again, it's not the role playing as the saint is not unique to this. There are lots of older spells that I am this pharaoh, I am Ramses, or I am, let's say, what's another good one? I am Osirinophris, right, from the Headless One. And so I am Moses, you get a lot of like, because the idea is like, okay, well, why should I listen to you, punk? It's like, wait a second, like this person in that moment is temporarily assuming the authority of this legendary figure. So on the other hand is, the anxiety is, if something miraculous happens, how do we know that it's a miracle, comes from God? Because even the saints, they get their power from God, right? It's not literally the saint that does it. It's God moving through the holiness of the saint that allows it to happen. It needs to be from God, because the idea is, otherwise the saint is just a witch, right? It's just a magician who has power, Or is it again coming from a demon, or is it coming from the person themselves who somehow sold their soul to get this power? Or somehow they have this power because they're born with it, or their father was an incubus or something, like with Merlin. And so that becomes the anxiety, right? So a lot of it has to do with, as I said, the authority of God being supreme and asking God for the permission for this to happen, right? So if it happens, then he must have consented to it, right? Whereas the other anxiety is like, and that's the thing with sometimes you get the same effect, someone is healed, but is this act of ritual power the result of a miracle, which is therefore holy, or the result of sorcery, which is therefore damned, right? And the line is very, very blurry and very difficult to discern. It's often a political charge, right? The whole reason to make this line is to save yourself in a way from being persecuted as a witch or as a sorcerer, and also maybe because you yourself really don't want it to be demonic, you really want it to be the saint, So that becomes a whole other dimension to us.
So how did they try to solve that dilemma, the issue of discerning whether it's a genuine angel or some sort of demonic
It
thing?
can, well, on the one hand, it can be totally arbitrary. It can be totally whether or not the priest who oversees this thing or the particular inquisitor believes you, or has a reason to believe you. Maybe you're just the rival and there's a reason to brand you as someone evil so they can, haul you off and then install their own person. On the other hand, sometimes there were like little ways of divining this, like divination-wise, like to see if, like the effect of the magic, how do things smell? Do you smell like foul odors? That's probably a demon, right? Or did a dove slowly descend from the sky and light open upon everyone? That's probably from God, So it becomes these little ways of actually kind of like reading nature and reading signs. But again, it doesn't apply everywhere. Sometimes it's completely arbitrary and it's just a political thing.
And that's a very different way for your social narrative to move along. Imagine if it was a risk in your life, a bunch of people come to you on a cloudy day and they're starting to have suspicions, then all of a sudden a bird flies by at the right time. They're like, actually we're good, keep going.
That's the other thing too is like people, whether they consider themselves like magicians is something that maybe like later scholars or people who didn't like them were putting onto them. But a lot of people like didn't really see what they were doing as particularly special. Everyone needed a village healer, someone who knew herbs, and sometimes people who were accused of like being witches or being magicians, in a negative sense, were midwives. People who just happened to know a lot of medical knowledge. Knew how to alleviate pain in birthing mothers, or knew how to cure particular illnesses and so on, right? And so the people who were sought out because maybe your village doesn't have a doctor necessarily, or maybe the closest person who can really help you is far away. You need someone to solve immediate problems. A lot of like magic also is about finding lost objects or figuring out who stole your thing, finding out why your cow isn't producing enough milk. This is a real anxiety. Maybe you'll lose your money. You're going to lose your food. What happens if your animals are dying? Did someone put a curse on them? Is someone stealing the milk from your cow and putting it in their cow? You get to be suspicious of people. Like, why is this person so wealthy suddenly? Why are their animals so fat and look so healthy? Like, are they stealing from me? So people start accusing each other of these different things. But essentially, it's not considered very supernatural, right? It's considered to be just sort of like a thing that happens, essentially, in the broad sense of causality in the world. And now you have this question of, well, what are we going to do about it? Maybe it's malefica, like bad sorcery, negative magic, or maybe it's something different. But, coincidence isn't an easy answer to accept because you need an answer. You need to know why this is happening to you, right? Because will you survive the winter? And also jealousy. Like, for example, I mentioned the guy I'm studying, Cyprian, some of his books, for example, in Portugal and Spain, who owned them? There were legends about this person, right? Or the idea is maybe this person doesn't own a copy of this book, but they're wealthy, and there's something coming into a lot of luck. Maybe they somehow inherited some money from a dead relative, but I don't know it came from a dead relative. Maybe they found a buried treasure, and they're not sharing it with anyone. They're not telling anyone about it, right? I'm starting to hate them a lot. I'm just noticing that their animals are looking good, and mine are suffering. Mine caught a disease. Theirs didn't catch the disease. This isn't fair. So the idea is like maybe this person has the book, right? I was talking to a friend from Portugal, and he was saying like in one of his grandparents' villages, the same anxiety comes about werewolves. The person who is wealthier is the werewolf. Where I come from, sometimes it's the person who is suffering a lot. Maybe they're being plagued because one of their relatives was a vampire and he died, and now he's coming back to haunt his family. You have to figure out that problem. Or someone is very wealthy suddenly because they're married to a dragon, and the dragon is providing a lot of money to them or protecting them and so on. Or this village is carrying a lot of prosperity, probably because the dragon who married that person's daughter is making the weather shine on them, essentially, and give them rain when they need it and so on. So this becomes a way to figure out inequalities, right? When you're jealous or when you're anxious or when you're suffering from very real problems, right? You need to figure out why this is happening and how can we remedy it, right? And is the remedy to pick a scapegoat in the village, this is the witch, and get them out? Or is it like, maybe this person has power and they can help me, right? So, and then sometimes people are completely fine with this until someone comes around and starts asking the right questions about who's actually the problem here. And everyone points to that person.
I'm really happy you're mentioning all of these examples. Mm-hmm. And it's clicked in my head an article I read a long time ago. There's this anthropologist, his name is David Graeber, and he's well-renowned amongst left-leaning types because he tends to be a left-leaning type. Mm-hmm. So he does a lot of work on anarchy, for example.
Yeah.
And he writes that in traditional societies, ones that still exist and have very elaborate mythologies, the ones that have something that most closely approximate anarchy, something with genuinely no difference in power strata, no hierarchy, they have the most thorough supernatural cosmic battle systems that they use to mediate that. And precisely this thing that you're mentioning is the case, that whoever has a lot of power all of a sudden is suspect for being a witch. And so then there's some sort of hunt against that person, some supernatural reason to either murder them or socially abstract that power away from them.
Because it's a lot like, especially if you're jealous, right? Like, you can't be jealous if someone is just being blessed by the God, right? Because then the question is, well, why isn't God blessing me? Whereas if it's like maybe she married a demon, and that demon is giving her all the stuff, or she married a fairy or something like that, then it becomes suspect, right? There's something completely illicit that's going on that's screwing with the fabric of the cohesion of the village.
Right. So perhaps the revolution is better helped if capitalism is understood for the demon it is. So, I mean that very literally, by the way. I see you have a question. Almost. Hold on, I have a few things I want to get to first, but we will get to you soon. I was going to stop closest to 8 to open it up and see if there were questions available. Okay, so where was I going with that? Yeah, we had power. Oh yeah, also I wanted to give an example as well from Judaism, because that, like the book Exodus and all of the law and that is very impressive for, and in the books that follow, for having measures in place in society to redistribute wealth. Every 50 years or so, you have to let go of all of your slaves. You have to, every so many intervals, give somebody an opportunity to buy back their property if they had to buy it because they were too poor. There's all of these equalizing methods within that particular religion. Do you think that any of those carried over into Christianity? I mean, it seems it appealed to people perhaps because of that, but within even the magic, when people are having all of their anxieties, etc., is there something in there that's giving them a more grounded and less supernatural way to grapple with the anxieties of inequality and how to...
Well, I mentioned before that like early Christians call each other like brother and sister in these very like familial, loving terms. There was a very attitude, like there's a very strong attitude towards sharing and community, right? That especially if you're persecuted, right, and you are isolated. You're literally isolating yourself socially from your family members who are still pagans and so on, right? You want to, and you realize you're possibly in danger from the government. So there's this inclination to share. Also, Jesus himself as a figure who walked with the poor, walked with lepers, walked with prostitutes and so on. Was very much not afraid to be among the people who were considered to be dirty, or in other words, like a problem and so on. So there's this inclination towards kindness and mercy and affection towards especially those who are suffering the most, and so and to alleviate their problems, right? So there's this actions, charities towards the poor. Like I think to this day, like the greatest charities that exist in the world is the Roman Catholic Church, I believe, if I know by like pure numbers. So a lot of charities come from there, right? So there's this idea that you're helping the poor, and Jesus of course feeding many and constantly healing people and so on. So there's this inclination towards showing grace to people who are less fortunate than you, and this inclination towards a distrust of power structures in the same way, right? Especially if you're not trusting Rome, if you're not trusting the emperor, right? Which becomes an interesting question when Rome, modern day like Vatican, becomes this huge center of power, right? Who can root out and now kind of root out and police things, right? So that becomes the question of like how do we mediate that? But in general, there's this great emphasis on charity and in extending love to your neighbor, right?
So, I was wondering if maybe there would be less of the anxiety-driven supernatural responses to wealth, but as you've put it, it makes me think that perhaps in the Middle Ages and beyond, there was more of an impetus for supernatural solutions to wealth, because the people who are poor might have seen it as justification that the wealthy person perhaps isn't walking with God, because clearly they aren't being charitable and other people are suffering as a result of this inequality, etc. Even if it's just amongst one's flock.
Well, there's two problems. There's also the alliance between the church and the noble classes, right?
Yes, that confuses
yes, especially because like you have a lot of people who like if you're not going to get the throne, if you're not going to become the next successor, your brothers and your cousins are going to go become monks or enter the monastery. So like a lot of times, like when someone or when one of these like ecclesiastical family members dies, you're going to inherit all their books from the monastery. So that's how like certain like Queen, I believe Elizabeth the first had a lot of magical books in her library. She may not have touched them herself, but they came from her relatives and family members who were monks and so on. But then you have like the other side of the coin, I think, for the question of sort of anxiety and economic power essentially comes from the fact that magic can sometimes be a last response, right? Your last bet or your last trump card. If you're really suffering, you turn to these supernatural forces, right? Because if you can't solve it through other means. So the question is like, especially with like the court cases I mentioned and the lead tablets being buried, you can tell materially when we excavate these things, this was a real concern. People went out of their way to do this stuff, right? To carve these lead tablets and to bury them by the courthouse, right? So the question is, this was something that really was driving people. This person who made this really needed this court case to go in his favor. So we can track sort of like the needs of people, or like looking at grimoire spells and seeing what are they tailored towards. Are they for getting you promoted in the army, or are they for helping you find treasure? Are they helping you get married because you're a woman who is now without a husband and you're in a precarious situation in your society? So essentially, like when it becomes the sort of last chance, you can see the desperation. How far are you willing to go? Like, are you going to get the lead, or are you going to go bind this doll? And it becomes a sort of thing that's a private act. It's often not public. You're not going to a temple and worshiping and doing something very public people can see you doing. It's often like hidden. You're burying it in locations. You're going to graves when no one's looking and doing certain things. From your own home, you're burning particular like instances of doing particular things. So it becomes this kind of private method to like bargain with the forces of reality to somehow give you a leg up, especially if you're suffering.
I have a lot of gears turning in my head about the psychology of magic based on that, but I'm not going to share now, but I'm very excited. So thank you for giving me those exciting thoughts. Okay, there's two things I want to cover before I open it up to questions. The first one I suppose I'll go to is, what does Christian magic look like today?
Oh, Lord. So that is something, again, it could be like several theses, because Christianity, of course, is the largest religion in the world, and it's changed everywhere depending on where it is. It looks a lot different in, a major Mexican city than it does a Mexican village. It adopts old forms and so on, that changes with people. It looks very different in Africa than it does in, let's say, other parts of the world and so on. So basically, like, it's not, you can't answer that question broadly, right? Because you have all these different traditions where you get Europe to this day. We have rural traditions of folk healing where people pray psalms over plants and try and expel things by putting rocks on your blister and taking it off and flinging it into a river and so on to get it to go away. You have people petitioning saints. I don't know if anyone here has been to a church that sold St. Joseph home selling kits, because no one there will say it's magic, but like you get a little statue of St. Joseph and you bury him upside down in your lawn. And then when the house sells and you get a lot of money, you take him out and you put him somewhere and you give him some, like, you basically pray to him. That looks a lot to me like the whole like torturing the god and then making it do something for you and rewarding with offerings, but no one's going to say that, right? On the other hand, and I was at a big Catholic church in Washington, D.C., and they were selling all of these little home selling kits. You can get them on Amazon, And I was thinking to myself, this looks very magical, but no one here is going to agree with me with that, because they're going to think that it's a negative thing, right? On the other hand, you have, any grocery store in Kensington Market sells 7-day candles with saints on them. And you can get one on the back, just a prayer in Spanish or whatever like that, and it'll tell you, like, this is what you pray for a love, to get a lover, this is what you pray for this. The hoodoo tradition, the root work, came through black slaves who were taken to the Americas and so on. And they had the whole knowledge of herbal lore from their, where they were taken from, and it blended with sort of indigenous American attitudes towards healing, as well as saints when they became converted, especially since a lot of the slaves were already Christian by the time they were taken to the Americas. So it involves like saints and African gods and sort of like attitudes towards healing and so on, that all get lumped together to make sure that, your boss isn't too hard on you, or you can get your job. I walked into a botanica in Maryland, and a woman was on the phone. She was buying candles and a bunch of herbs, and she was talking about how her son is suffering because of student loans, can relate. And basically, and she was like, I'm trying to like put these herbs together to get him wealth and so on, and she was trying to pick which saint would work best for that, So again, like, this looks very formulaic in the same way we're talking about, right? So there's all these different attitudes towards that completely change depending on the culture. Needless to say, a long answer, but it's everywhere, right? And it's sometimes in the places where you don't think it will be, right? And again, when you look at people who are doing this, and if you ask them, are you doing magic, you'll get 1,000 different answers. Because some people might be like, no, this is just work. This is just prayer. This is just me trying to help my son out. And some people will be like, oh yeah, this is definitely magic.
So it seems from this discussion that we can articulate magic in at least this very broad sense that you're discussing it, where this example is magic and this example is magic, as a very broad sort of like theatrical approach to life, where you have to carry out some act that has some non-obvious significance, works with non-obvious beings, and works according to like narrative and the idea of sympathy.
And I was just gonna say, like, but that's the question too: is how is that different from like a religion, right? You know,
Right.
where again you go to like a dimly lit room full of chanting people, and they make wine into blood, you know, and then you drink it, and somehow something changes in you, right? You know, or for example, you know, narratives of religion, the ancient stories about gods and myths and so on, you know, and how does that have any bearing on me today? Well, somehow it's all connected and so on. So you know, again, that's what the first question, which is such a struggle to answer, is how is it different? You know. Kind of depends on who you ask, and it depends on the attitude of the person, because you don't want to be like, well, what you're doing is clearly magic, you know, and the person is offended and saying, no, I'm just praying to Saint Joseph to sell my house, you know. But that's why we use the language of like ritual specialists and ritual techniques and so on, because there is a ritual element to it, whether it's public, you're doing it in front of everyone at a temple, or whether it's private from your own home. There are actions that accompany words, maybe if they're spoken, that accompany beliefs and attitudes towards the world and beings, you know, and they all come together for a desired effect. There's a purpose to this, right? There's a telos. And so the question is then, you know, how are we judging that morally is a completely separate sort of discussion, which often depends on politics.
So the question that is begged by this whole problem with, well, what is magic? And, you know, I, for one, am all for opening up the scope of the definition, but of course, you know, as you said, we have to take into account, well, you know, when we're having everyday conversations, how are we going to approach this? But insofar as we're just having an academic discussion, and we're interested in philosophy and practice and saying things with fewer words as opposed to more. With this very broad sense of magic, I'm wondering, what do Christians do that isn't magic in that broad sense? Like, what would be a particular practice or ritual?
So, remember when I mentioned the Greek magical papyri? Some of them you have these extremely elaborate, and again, this is not Christian necessarily, but I'll tie it in. There's like all these different things that are like long prayers and extremely involved rituals with the pins, or like dream incubation or prophecies, or trying to get like compelling the stars to do things. And then there's one, it's I think 2 lines long, and it's how to make an egg look like a tomato, and it says dye the egg red. And so like, and this is in that collection, right? You know, so my point is like, is that magic? That's just a science fair trick. Come on, man. You know, like, but at the same time, it's like there's a range of things that are so simple, right? And again, I made that as a sarcastic example, but it is in there. But there's also like very simple ones, like, you know, say this 7 times, the end. You know, or like, and then there's one which is like, go to this place when the sun is rising and bring a falcon with you, which you drown in milk, you know, and then take the falcon out and make this, and you're going to embalm it, and this will become a familiar spirit that will serve you forever. And this is its name, and wear this thing on your chest, which will then have its name on it, you know, and you can police it around, give it a feast, and make sure that like a young boy who's a virgin is there, who's going to lay out the food on the table. Very complicated stuff versus say this thing 7 times, right? You know, so, you know, like, again, the question is like, you know, what isn't magic? Well, it's like, I think, you know, magic again can be a pejorative term still. It's not for like some people, right? But at the same time, like it can be, not everyone feels the same way. So, you know, it's more about sort of like what isn't ritual. Because I think, you know, sometimes we talk about like it's kind of like some people like stay every day when they go to school, they have to recite the Pledge of Allegiance in America, you know, or when they go to a sports festival, you know, they have to stand up and sing the national anthem. And there's like rituals associated with this. You get like sports players who like, I have to tie my left shoe first before my right shoe, you know, or I have to like spin around and do these things and stuff like that, you know. It's ways of interacting and making sense of a chaotic world, right? You know, and organizing people, organizing them towards, maybe you're not literally worshiping the spirit of your soccer team, but you're wearing their colors, you know, and you're really hoping they win, and you do certain little things with your fans who you're watching the things, chanting their names, giving them, you know, it's all that kind of stuff. So basically, what I hope people can take away from this is that the world is just pregnant with meaning making, assigning meaning to things, figuring out the way that stars in the sky are actually an archer, or actually a bull or a snake, you know, or figuring out the way that because this plant flowers in this particular way, it relates in some way to this other concept. And if I imbibe this flower as a tea, I will get the healing properties of the other concept, and so on, you know, or all these different things, right? These associations are drawn in incredibly things that we think are secular, you know, including the ways we regard very normal things about our lives, you know. So in the end, sort of like the general gist of it is like keep your mind open towards the way that you make meaning in your life, and also consider the ways in which things that normally don't construct themselves as being this way are in fact like full of these possibilities, right? And full of ways that people are trying to make sense of chaos and trying to implant a sense of control, right? Because the world is scary, right? But if there are little things you can do, and at least you know I'm in control of this, if I just tie my shoelace this way, it's going to be okay, right? It's a way to calm one down and to be focused and to have a kind of, people talk about placebo effect, but it's a way to focus and be, I've solved this problem. This little thing I can do, it might mitigate a bigger problem for me, right?
Well, that was very beautiful and elegant and relevant.
Thank you.
I appreciate you throwing the meaning-making thing in there because, life's great. There's so much wonder that is possible. And because it was such a good thing, if need for cognition were not my only personality trait, I would be like, let's leave there and everyone clap and that was wonderful. We've learned things. Let's go home. But I promised a friend that I would ask this question. So what are some of the most darkest and fucked up things that have ever happened in the name of Christian magic that you know of?
I mean, the weird rape spell I mentioned is pretty bad, but there's a lot of the grimoires have some pretty nasty spells. There's a lot of I think in the Red Dragon you have to sacrifice a goat, I think, and to one of the demons in order to get them to give you wealth and so on. There's a lot of really weird things that involve there's all these demons that can do pretty cruel things, give people nightmares, or make someone, essentially compel someone to feel a certain way, or to take their memories out and put new ones in, all this creepy stuff, right? So it's a lot of what can the spirit do, right? And if you know what the spirits can do and you know how to command them, then you can essentially command that power, right? So honestly, if you read any catalog of these spells, there's a lot of really cruel ones in there. There's some that involve just torturing an animal, but saying that the animal's torture is this person's torture, so again, it's that sympathetic link and so on. There's a lot of weird things people will do in the name of this stuff, right? But on the one hand is I think an interesting sort of way to think about it too is what's the goal and what would motivate someone to do that? What mind state do they have to be in to want to go this length to? Maybe it's because the person that they're torturing, it seems like a gross thing, but maybe that person ruined their life in a very significant way, and they're getting revenge on a major enemy, or maybe there's this the reason someone's going to go to this length to get money is because they're in the worst moment of their lives, So I think that's kind of a more interesting question than just the shock and awe answer of what are awful spells.
Yeah, I think that's actually interesting because within that answer you could just say, well, what do really desperate people do in really desperate circumstances anyways?
Yeah.
And probably they would do those things for magic also. Cool.
But also that's the thing about, I mentioned the private element of it, no one can see you do this, It's a very public thing to rob a bank, right? And there's a risk of getting caught, but there's this idea that if I do this, it's more covert, right?
Yes, okay. Yeah, that's cool. Okay, so here's an example that's coming to me. So if you're the Joker and you live in a nihilistic society that doesn't really have strong religious things, maybe you go out and do the public thing,
chuckling to that.
Shooting somebody on live television. But maybe he could have tortured a dog in private.
Well, that's the thing. But no. Hold on. But here's the thing too: is there's a catharsis in making it public, right?
Of course.
Forcing everyone to see it. So the society that you feel wronged you has to confront it, right?
Totally.
Whereas torturing an animal in private, it's between basically yourself and your demons, right?
Right. But what tools and technologies are available to that kind of person, right?
Yeah. Same thing with a terrorist attack that's public. Someone who shoots up a mall versus someone who kills their parents or their spouse or something like that.
Right.
Depends on the message of anyway. Yeah.
And if you have no gods, maybe public is more available to you as an act that you want to try to go for. That's an interesting link. Okay, well on that very happy note, let's let other people ask some questions. And yes, thank you for all of that. Joe, I think, has been dying to ask something.
Look at how high that hand is. Yep.
That's so cool. Okay. I had this really cool image. Before I ask my question, I just wanted to make a note. We brought up the Roman priests,
praying to the other guy's gods, yeah.
It was kind of like the equivalent of that's what a team is doing when they're cheering on their the sports team is now the army. We're cheering them on to get them to win.
Or when you boo the person who's your team's on defense and they're on offense and you're just heckling them, yeah.
I can just picture it would be the weird equivalent of seeing a Red Sox fan have a shrine to a Blue Jay, just saying, "Let our team win. We'll feed you bird feed." No, so my question is, have you done any research into Zoroastrianism in terms of its influence on Christianity and magic, because I'm trying to make like the idea of summoning a demon in a Zoroastrian sense kind of makes sense when you have a dualistic system where the god of good and the god of evil are on equal terms. Because I just watched this movie called Hereditary, where it's been out for a couple of years, so spoilers, they summon a demon, right, who has power, right? And I just, in a Christian I never thought of it before, but when you think about summoning a demon in a Christian context where God is all powerful and he's condemned a spirit to hell, right? It's like it would be weird in a real world sense if a king condemned a criminal to prison but let him keep his armor and sword and armies and put him on house arrest. You know what I mean? It's like, and not only can you not only is he in prison, but people can petition to release him from prison in order for him to like go to battle in his name. It's like if God is like the major domo, why would he let these demons keep their powers if all their power comes directly from God anyway, if they're just angels that have fallen, right? But if you're thinking of demons in a Zoroastrian sense, then all demons are servants of Angra-Mainyu, who is equal to Ahura Mazda, and really what a demon is just something that's trapped in the world that Ahura Mazda made, and all it wants to do is destroy and get out, right? Because they're trapped in matter. So it makes sense that angels are beings of order that love to create and be in harmony with nature, while demons are nihilistic and all they want to do is destroy and return to the void from whence they came, right? So do you think this has kind of been lost in Christian history, that the idea of heaven and hell, the idea of the devil versus God, that these were all originally Zoroastrian concepts that might have influenced Judaism and then eventually made its way to Christianity?
I have no clue, because like my knowledge of Zoroastrianism is quite basic. And also just a problem with scholarship is trying to trace the origins of things. It's like we never know. And even when we say Christian, it can mean 1,000 things to 1,000 people, right? You know, the way it looks in a Catholic tradition, which Catholic, is it Italian, is it Spanish, is it Mexican, can look very different than an Orthodox one or a Protestant one. Protestant magic looks a lot different, and which kind of Protestant magic looks different than other kinds of Christian magic and so on. But and it's interesting that you mentioned the prisoners, because like prisoners are often used as essentially slave labor, by sort of in the time periods that we're talking about. So they can totally be mobilized, if slaves didn't build a temple, maybe the demons did, and stuff like that. But then the question is, we mentioned like, okay, the books are burned, but I still have the knowledge in my head. Maybe you're in, your swords are taken away, but you still remember how to use them, So it becomes this kind of broader theme of the fact that demons still have power. It depends on the theologian. Some theologians say, well, they have power so they can tempt us, right? And then we have to show our character by resisting that temptation, right? God lets demons do cruel things in the world to test us, to make sure that our faith is ironclad, essentially, right? Whereas others say it's like, well, Satan is always trying to wage a war against our hearts, and this is in the tension between giving into that temptation and choosing God in every moment is like this battle being played out, essentially. That the price of the battle is people's souls, right? And Satan's always trying to claim some, and God is always trying to win them. But ultimately, the agency is in the person. It's like whether or not they choose the right path, as it were, So it becomes a sort of like broader thing where what are demons doing? Are they following this impetus to persuade people, and that's why they have power, because God lets them have power, or is it some other purpose that they're following? It totally depends on the theologian. But again, and it's constructed differently within each grimoire. So some grimoires have a very particular attitudes about where demons come from and why they have the powers they do and why certain angels rule them. But also also Testament of Solomon, I mentioned one of the earliest examples of like putting an angel over every single demon, and you can figure out who controls who. Each demon controls different things in the world. It's not just that they can teach certain things, but this demon controls the legs. And so if you have a problem with your legs and you want to be healed, you ask the angel that rules that demon to force that demon to heal your legs. Same with your liver or your gut or your heart and your lungs and so on. So you micromanage the human body and problems in human society with spirits who have influence over those things. And then you figure out who rules them and you go there.
But why aren't we wholesaling? Why aren't we going straight to God?
So
and
that's
asking him?
that's also the question about saints, right?
Yeah.
Why pray to a saint when you can pray to God? And again, I think we talked about the baptismal seal. What happens when you're still kind of a bad person after you've been baptized, and you still lie and lust after people that you shouldn't be looking at and stuff like that? These questions that were a real problem for early Christians is always trying to figure out new solutions to that. So on the one hand, you have the question of like, well, if my prayer isn't working, is it because I'm not close enough for him to hear? Is it because no one can boss God around, right? So maybe he just doesn't want to grant this thing, but why? It's like, well, maybe God gave us saints and gave us angels to do that kind of work while he's busy doing other things. Again, it becomes a theological issue because different theologians have different opinions on the nature of saints and how appropriate is it to pray to them for certain things, and also why angels exist in the first place and what's the relationship with us. So are they going to intervene, or is a saint more appropriate? It all becomes the sort of question of, if it's not working, we got to figure it out, right? If the demon didn't do its job, was it the right demon? Was it someone else? Was I fooled? Did I contact the right angel? Did the angel listen to me? Did it hear me? So it becomes this kind of troubleshooting experience of if the spell doesn't work, we got to figure out a way to fix it. Mm-hmm.
Hey, well, thanks for that engaging discussion. I noticed a lot of it focused on angels, saints on the one hand, demons on the other. But you kind of mentioned there's this sort of third race almost that exists in this worldview, fairy folk, jinn, etc. This sort of created race that is not necessarily angelic or demonic.
Mm-hmm.
It even comes up in the Desert Fathers. St. Anthony meets a fallen. Interestingly, there's even modern writing one can find out of monasteries and so on, reflecting on the UFO phenomenon. Rather, Father Seraphim Rose was an Eastern Orthodox monk that passed away now from America. Had proposed, and this is kind of talked about in some Orthodox circles, that this is a modern manifestation of this kind of phenomenon. But I was wondering if you could kind of elaborate a bit more on that, like what role do those creatures play in this worldview and in Christian magic as it's occurring? Like, can they be controlled in the same way, or do they have power of their own, and so on?
That's a problem that a religion that's trying to convert people encounters when you meet spirits, right? So what happens when you come to a place and they already have a robust mythology about fairies or about other kinds of spirits that are not so easy to categorize as good or evil, right? So one option would be pseudonasius. They're angels, or they're other minor beings that are actually good guys, or they're demons, so just kind of forcing them to exist in one or the other, so you get some discourses around like fairy husbands and fairy familiars in Britain. They're just demons, and they're actually just incubi or succubi. They're these sex spirits that, are looking to basically damn you to hell. Another problem is then, well, what if people are not inclined to believe that? And they're like, no, these are just fairies and they're different and they have their own queens. They have their own, like hierarchies. You can't boss them around by Michael's name. You have to go to Titania or Oberon or these like major literary figures within the British fairy magic. So again, is Oberon a demon? Is he an angel, or is he just the king of fairies? In his particular, I'm thinking of like the grimoire, the Book of Oberon. And so this particular kind of problem has to do with organizing spirits, because again, making sense of the world, you got to make sense of who does what job, which spirit commands which thing, but also who do they belong to, who do they follow, is the spirit gonna, if I name off 30 names, which one's it gonna obey, right? So when you have other races or species of spirits that especially are not fitting neatly into the Christian worldview, you're always going to have some people who still believe in them and think that they're essentially different. You're going to have some people who think that they were former humans who somehow became one with nature or took a third route or something like that, or that they're things that just don't comfortably exist within the Christian paradigm and we just have to deal with that. So for example, like this is really popular in sort of like the Balkans where I'm from, because you have a lot of people who, if you ask them what's your religion, they'll all say Christian. I'm Eastern Orthodox, I'm just Christian, And then like if you talk to them for a while and you've had a few like shots of rakia, and they'll be like, anyway, so we gotta make penance to this fairy spirit who got pissed off and now one of my dogs ran away, and that's definitely what happened. Or it's like, oh, Radko came back as a vampire and we gotta go stake him. Or like, oh, did you hear the woman in the village next door, her daughter became married to a dragon? And there's a whole discourse around that because dragons are considered to be like on the level of saints and angels, and they're good guys who serve God. And they're very lusty and they want to marry people, but that's a good thing,
Well, I believe even in the story, I think it's St. Anthony, or one of the other desert fathers with the fallen, in that story, the fawn in fact asks him to pray for his race, essentially, because they don't know themselves what their role is in the divine
it's like
plan.
I'm confused, to be
So-
honest. So that becomes interesting, the question of colonizing spirits, right? What happens when spirits begin, the interactions with people and spirits become tense in this way, right? So a lot of the African deities who came over through slavery gain masks, what are called masks, which is, it's like, okay, I'm not going to have this god up here, I'm going to swap him for a statue of this saint, right? And so when the religions became legal again to do and to practice, people still kept the saints. And there's this very famous quote by this one voodoo priest who said, I still keep the saint images on the altars because they protected us from the Christians. And the idea of saints protecting people from Christians is very fascinating, right? Because they hid the gods beneath them, right? Or you have other spirits, again, like the fawn, right, being kind of confused about his place. It's like, I don't know how, my world isn't this dualistic, I don't know where I'm supposed to be, these stories show us that, it's very hard to expunge all of this. If in the 21st century you still have people who are very anxious about who's marrying dragons and who became the werewolf, who killed that guy and took his wolf pelt and now is the new werewolf, and so on and so forth, is these questions that become mapped onto the saints as well, where you have very traditional Christian archetypes becoming syncretized with certain gods in different locations, and suddenly they have attitudes that are more similar to older gods. These memories continue, and new rituals are improvised. So if people don't want to give up a particular practice, you have to kind of make it Christian, But then what happens when those spirits who used to be worshipped a particular way now have this new economy of action to navigate, People find new ways around that all the time. And I think that's really fascinating, because then the question is it Christian? If you ask the people I know, they'll say totally Christian. We don't know a different way to do it. And frankly, the priest, when I asked him for help with the vampires, couldn't tell me anything, so I just went to the person who knows how to hunt them. The krasnik, this shaman figure who leaves their body and fights dark spirits at night. In Croatia. Mm-hmm.
I want to fit in a quick question first, because it came up when Joe was talking, but I forgot. Okay, so the movie Heredity or Hereditary?
Hereditary.
Mm-hmm. One thing that I couldn't get behind in that movie was okay, if you have a massively powerful demon being, why would you give it a body? Wouldn't that just piss it off? The whole thing is let's incarnate Paimon.
Mm-hmm.
But wouldn't he be seriously pissed if you gave him a body?
Ask Paimon.
Okay. I thought you might have some insight on that. You don't think that demons would be why did you put me here?
Well,
I was more powerful before.
Well, that's the thing too, is with the idea of demons and angels fighting over people's souls, right? Demons want the flesh; they want to incarnate or possess people in some forms of
So even angels want
exorcism.
to.
I don't know. That's the thing too. Is angels are understood as kind of having a different kind of body, right? A light body or a body made of air. Some of these spirits are considered to be so the Malleus Maleficarum, the famous witch hunting manual that was printed in Germany. At the time, I think it was the second most popular book after the Bible, so you can imagine so people are reading this. There's a whole chapter on it about incubi, these male sex spirits who try and have babies with women. And there's this whole chapter that asks, how do they do that? How do they get women pregnant? And there's this long discourse about, they condense the air and then somehow they can steal people's semen and use it themselves. And it's this long sort of process to try and figure out how this happens, right? But essentially there's this idea that, corrupting the flesh, somehow that if you're physical, you can affect more things. Again, I don't know, ask Paimon, but the general idea is careful. The general idea is essentially that, there's something to physical reality, right? And there's a certain level of power that is there that is not there in the other bodies, right? And
cool.
Yeah.
Okay. I think that's really important, especially for me to hear in magic, that this reality also has its powers that other places don't. Cool. So, did you want to ask?
I just kind of wanted to add that something that it analogizes to, right, is the idea of praying to a demon instead of praying to the higher God, right?
Mm-hmm.
Because as you said earlier,
They're closer.
The higher God can impact a lot, but almost very subtly.
Mm-hmm.
Whereas if you channel a demon, and then I imagine if a demon actually got into a body,
Mm-hmm.
then that's a lot more you could get immediate results now on a small scale.
It's even, no, honestly, there's a very obvious human parallel to this, right? Where it's just if you need something done, let's say for your class, right? Asking the professor is a lot more helpful than asking the dean of your particular school,
Yeah.
right? The idea is that person has a lot of power over the institution, right? But it's not going to be the best person to choose for this particular situation. And maybe that's just not in their kind of area of effect, right, essentially, right? You want someone who has direct control over that thing. So the demon rules the kidney and you have kidney disease, that's who you go to, instead of the angel who just brings justice in general.
This concept of thinking demons are valuable assets is I don't understand. It's like the equivalent of, imagine like picture this: World War II, Nazis are on trial for war crimes. The American government. It's like, oh, I don't want to ask the American government for help. I'm gonna go visit this Nazi in jail and ask him to help me with my financial troubles.
I don't think the metaphor quite extends that way, frankly.
You know what I mean? It's like these demons are angels that have been imprisoned and cast out.
Hold on, can I just say
Why do
something?
they have power? Why are they not? They're just like, if the rules are so clear.
Hold on, Joe. That's not the only demon narrative. That's the point. The word demon comes from a word which means like lesser spirit, force. It's a thing that has a particular pattern of operation. And then different narratives get constructed about demons. And there's a Zoroastrian narrative about demons in which they are inherently evil. And that's also just translating a word which was certainly from some Persian dialect into a word that was used in a similar context amongst us.
Oh, I'm aware of demons outside of. I'm thinking specifically why a Christian would ever find a demon attractive for asking for help.
Alternative narratives, they've always persisted, even in the Christian narratives.
Well, also think of the way that we treat modern prisoners, right, in solving problems. When the California fires were happening, it was the mobilization of the prisoners
Yeah.
that were used, right?
I mentioned like
Or
prisoners
when we
versus
ask
slave
Hannibal
labor.
Lecter to help solve a murder.
Exactly. You use the demons.
I answered my
where
own
you-
question.
Yeah,
You
you
don't want to
want
sully the hands of an angel
Sometimes you need
or
a
a
demon
human.
to solve it, to fight a demon.
That's where the
and
Nazis
so there was-
have to get Nazis to build your spaceships.
Right, exactly, yeah. You just give them a salary, and if they don't kill anyone else.
Yeah.
But like America literally did import Nazi scientists. Operation
yes.
Paperclip was all about that. But anyway.
So we do it all the time in all schools of life.
Okay, very good, yeah.
Before we move on, I know you were going to mention some examples about this because you, in passing, mentioned you might want to convert the acts of some sort of like lesser demon to good. Can you give an example of how that works in magical practice?
Well, the idea of elevation, right? We talked about Neoplatonism and like elevating your soul, higher. There's also this idea that like, well, maybe, through reincarnation or through otherwise, you can also elevate other spirits. So some of the monks engaging with sort of like talking to angels was for kind of scientific pleasure. It's just to figure out, talk to the angel. Like, this is a really cool idea. Like, get their insight onto like broader schemes, understand theology, clarify the books more for you, right? On the other hand, you can try and get a demon to essentially ascend and return to God, right? Because then you're depriving Satan of one more person in his army, right? You're redeeming. Now, of course, only God can forgive in this sense, right? But you're trying to like get the demon to work off its like badness essentially to kind of by making it do good things essentially. So this is just one concept that some people write about having approached, but other people are like no, this is up to God to decide. I'm just using him for this reason,
Right.
and letting him remember who's boss, which is this angel and that kind of thing.
I'm glad to know there are cosmic altruists out there, though. I think Asana seems kind of first.
Okay, so you've talked a lot about how people try and distinguish between true religion
Mhm.
and evil sorcery. I'm wondering if you're aware of people kind of making a distinction between religion and magic in a more banal way. So to elaborate a bit, for example, a contemporary religious person might, if they're ill, pray to God
Mhm.
for better health, and then they also go to the pharmacy,
Mhm.
and that's seen, as a totally natural thing.
Yeah.
There's kind of no discourse there, and I wonder if that kind of dualistic attitude comes up at all for Christian musicians, and also sort of where and when it would come up, if you
Mhm. I think the issue there is because very few people who are doing the kind of stuff I'm describing describe themselves as magicians, right? Now we're seeing a resurgence of people who are interested in occultism, who come from Christian backgrounds and were raised Christian, reclaiming that title for themselves because, let's say they're fascinated by grimoires or they're in lodges that kind of venerate magic and so on, and they're looking to sort of like redeem that image, right? But generally, like a lot of people would just say like they don't see it that way, right? So it becomes a question of what's the practice they're engaging with, going into the pharmacy versus praying, or praying to a saint versus praying up psalm over a herbal mixture which you then put on yourself or eat, it depends on the person. Someone might see this is the same thing, essentially. I'm just kind of going at it through different ways, kind of spreading myself, trying to affect it as best as I can. It's kind of like, hitting as many possibilities as you can, so you can maximize your effect. On the other hand, you have some people who do keep a particular line, especially depending on if you're hiring someone to do magic for you. So if you ask for your name to be read and to be prayed for by your community, different thing than going to that person who lives in that particular house and asking them if they could make a paste for you or something like that. So it also becomes, are you doing it for yourself, or are you hiring a specialist to do it for you? And what kind of rank does that specialist have in your society? Are they the village shaman, or are they priest? Do they have the authority of an institution like a church behind them, or are they kind of like a person for hire that's just kind of a freelancer? And if they don't have the backing, then the question becomes muddier, right? Because it seems like maybe they're a Christian too, but they don't. But the church is like, wait a second, you should have gone to the priest. So it's a lot of like, it often depends on how the person themselves kind of compartmentalizes things, and very few will explicitly call it magic or identify as magicians, or say that they're doing magic or that they are magicians doing this, right? Just like, well, I'm just praying and trying to heal myself.
I think Jane
Yeah.
had a question next.
Yeah. Hi.
Hi.
Hello. I just wanted to ask, because you mentioned the grimoire theorem,
Yeah.
right? And I feel like that's such an interesting example
Mhm.
of the grimoire tradition to bring up.
Yeah.
Because it really emphasizes the practice of pact making
Yeah.
with demons
Yeah.
or demons. And I was wondering if you wanted to talk a bit more about that and about like spirit relationships
Yeah.
and that topic specifically, because
Yeah.
it's a very contentious issue among
It is.
people.
So the Grimoire Verum, it's called literally the true Grimoire. It's a short text that the hierarchies of spirits do not have relationships with angels in the same way that we're used to. It's very much like there's a trinity of spirits, Lucifer, Beelzebub, and Astaroth, who rule over all the legions. So, and there's a big emphasis on essentially getting these spirits, like these main three, to boss around the lower demons. So you're not going to a celestial spirit, essentially, to do this for you. You're going to the demon's boss, instead of the boss of the demons, the demon who's the boss of the other demon. And so, as a result, and the Verum has an emphasis on pacts and sort of these almost mutually assured relationships where the anxiety isn't so much about like the potential moral issues on the spirit, but more like making sure the pact is sealed and emphasized, and that the spirit signs the book too, and that you create the pact essentially that they will go ahead and pledge to. So it's this very weird example in the grimoire tradition in general, because it seems much more about spirit relationships that aren't as much about bossing spirits around, but more like making sure the pacts are kept, they're made, and that also that they're honored essentially. So it's a weird one, because it's a bit more like a bartering or contracting with like a human than it is with like getting someone's manager to force someone to do something. There is a threat of that because there's demons who rule everything, but essentially you're going up a hierarchy of spirits who are all in relationships with each other, which is weird because again it's a very, very much about just the demons and their hierarchies in their society in a way, which other grimoires have less of an interest in, because they're much more about using particular divine names to command spirits in a very particular way. It's less of a top-down approach that comes with threats, and much more like a you're the crafty one who's getting in this weird society of spirits, so how are you going to navigate them and actually make these particular ties?
So I noticed that you spend a lot of time talking about these like underground magical practices,
Mhm.
but then also when you're asked what's an example of like something that Christian people did that's not magic,
Mhm.
you weren't going and like, oh well, praying and doing like all these like ordinary ritual practices. So it seems like in some sense you regard those as like ordinary practices, somewhat magical, which makes sense to me.
I don't know, because the thing, again, people will disagree with that, and the problem is like collections of spells that we have, some of them are just prayers, right? Say this thing 7 times to this god, right? And that's it. So there's no other accompanying physical actions. But the other problem is too, just so you guys are aware, when we have collections like grimoires, we don't know, those are like notes, right? Imagine someone takes your notes for a class. They're not really going to know everything from the class. They're not going to know what happened. They're not going to know if there are physical portions to this. Like maybe when the best analogy for this is a recipe. When you get your grandmother's recipe, maybe she taught you how long you should stir things for, or how much you should really add, but the actual recipe just says salt, or like, 30 minutes or something like that. It doesn't say much more than that. So a lot of these things are a magician's notes essentially to themselves to remember the key parts, but they aren't that detailed. So we don't know if there's a whole realm of other things. While you're praying the name 7 times, there's all these other things you're doing. So essentially, again, I would hesitate to sort of like draw the line between magic and religion in this way. There's ritual actions, right? And so the question is, which are what is it different? But you make a really good point, right? Which is, lots of people just pray in various religious contexts, right? And we would consider that a ritual action that falls under a religious sort of category. And then what happens when you pray to a fairy, right? Because the fairy isn't Christian, as it were, and it's not in that economy or that sort of social bracket that we have this whole cosmic narrative taking place in. So is it a religious prayer? Is that person's faith that of something else? What if that person identifies as Christian? Right? So it becomes this whole problem with sort of labeling things in a way as to belief as opposed to what it's doing or the effect it's having for the person while they're doing it in the first place.
Right. I have another question related to that, which is like, I think one of the things that happened in the movement of modern theism is this kind of like collapsing of the highly morally ambiguous pantheons of gods into like personifications of good and evil. And I've heard, this may be like a naive sort of question, but I've like heard about this distinction between like light and dark magic, which is sometimes considered, well, light magic would be like appealing to the good and then trying to align yourself with like the good in the universe and then allow it to express itself through you. Whereas there's like the like darker magic would be the more narcissistic, like I have a will, try to like align the universe with my will and then like be expressed in that way. And I'm wondering if you have any like comments on that generally and its relationship with these sorts of things, and then also if that might be not always, but oftentimes found in the distinction between the more ordinary religious rituals and then the more like esoteric magical things.
That's also a thing that is pretty modern, right? Is because like a lot of times like old texts don't differentiate at all between doing something for yourself versus doing something for others. It also, because like witch hunter might be like, well, it's all magic to me. I don't care if you're doing it for a good reason. You should have been praying, or you should have just gone to a priest. On the other hand, is like there are discourses among modern occult magical communities that are about figuring out what good magic is versus what bad magic is, which is also kind of funny and very Christian. It's like very like in its attitudes, even though people sometimes don't identify as being Christian. But there's these like holdover attitudes towards like moralizing rituals, right? So if someone is doing, and again, it's the funny thing about it, like the idea of like good versus evil magic, right? Well, what happens if, like I said, the widow who needs a husband and is going to really suffer if she doesn't have one, and this is kind of her last shot, versus you're embodying a saint and appealing to goodness and talking about why Jesus redeemed you, and then you're using it to curse someone, So it becomes this really weird territory behind like everything is trying to affect the world in a particular way. And the anxiety behind it is like, well, who are you to try and affect the world? Maybe you should have been praying, maybe you shouldn't have intervened at all. But if you're going to, and if you don't see it as a problem, and if your community doesn't see it as a particular problem, maybe someone else is going to see it as a problem, right? But it's fine with you, then how are you going to decide what are the appropriate ritual actions and ritual intents, right? Because same thing with crime. You don't want someone going around just cursing everyone because they can. That causes anxiety in the community, right? So on the other hand, is like the policing of these forces, especially when you become anxious that someone has real power, is how can we make sure that they don't use it to screw me up if I just happen to offend them one day.
Right. I heard you talk a lot about, well, okay, I am a widow and I want a husband, or I'm in love with this girl, I want her to be in love with me, or I don't want to get executed in this trial or whatever it is, and not a lot of, I want to appeal to like a higher moral being and then sort of discover what they think is the best
so
thing to
I'm
do.
glad you brought that up, because there are entire spells, both in the Christian tradition as well as in the Greek ones, which are for that, to seek enlightenment. So there are spells, for example, to petition the deity to reveal a revelation to you. And you suddenly have this flash of insight and you're sensing the world more. Or to make you smarter, to make you understand philosophy better, to make you kind of understand God and God's beauty in a more deep way, and so on. So there's ones that are kind of for these intellectual purposes, to kind of like, and it's funny because it's not a firm distinction, because some of the demons are specifically summoned to teach you rhetoric, grammar, astronomy, liberal arts, broadly speaking, chemistry, I guess, alchemy, you know. So there's like certain demons that are, you kind of call them to tutor you essentially in things that are pretty intellectual, you know, and not necessarily just to like give your enemy nightmares and make them, you know, like make their teeth rot out, you know. And so so again, it's like these weird ways of interacting with the world, but it's up to kind of the person as to what they want to do with it. So there's these long rituals to gain transcendent states, to enter mystical or like trance states to comprehend the world in a better way, you know, or to gain insights and so on, which can be used for, I guess, art or, you know, philosophy and so on. It's this weird, because again, one of the questions that, you know, we've talked about is, not necessarily today, but like in earlier conversations, is mysticism versus sorcery, you know, trying to attain particular states and get a close relationship with a particular spirit or like a god, versus trying to act on the world in a particular way using the power of those beings. And when do those lines get blurred? Because sometimes because you gain this alternate state, you can actually affect the world more, or versus engaging in these operative sources gives you more power, which then lets you engage in alternate states. It's really broad and weird. I wish I could be more precise, but I think that that's the beauty of this, is that it's so complicated and interesting and deeply fascinating to think about the social anxieties and circumstances of the people who are actually writing these things down and doing them. Why would someone write down all their magic if they could be persecuted for it? Maybe they want to preserve it for some other reason, or they want to figure out what those weirdos are doing so they can go persecute them more.
It's probably easier to hide from authority back before you have the internet and everything too.
Like, don't dig up my old Tumblr blog, you know?
I gotta take down my MySpace. But I want to get a sense of how many people have questions that they've been holding right now. Definitely Joe. Because I have to make a call, so I'm trying to decide if I just leave and let you guys have your thing for a few minutes, or I'll just wait till
We can make it more
Yeah, wait
casual.
till the end. We don't wait.
Oh no, I mean I'll come back. It'll be like 10 minutes.
Yeah, we use my question.
Oh, sorry, Joe. Okay, I'll wait. We'll just wrap it up in like 10 minutes.
Yeah.
If that's okay, because it's almost 9, so we're running close to the end. So go ahead. Oh wait, unless was that?
Yeah, I asked a lot of questions. I want to make sure other people have an opportunity.
Okay, I wanted to make sure you two were finished.
Yeah?
Can I ask, I'm not like very informed on all of this, but I'm confused the way that you talked about like African Christian magic, for example. It doesn't really sound, like basically I'm confused about like the inherently violent nature of colonialism and how Christian missionaries were like an instrument of that. How did Christian magic interact with like traditional magic in those places? Like, yeah, what was
That's a wonderful question, and it's something that there's a lot of really good books that are coming out on that, and the legacies of colonialism in Africa, and the way that like indigenous spiritual systems were changed by it, you know, but also the ways that sort of like Christianity was changed in the process. So like you have like a woman being possessed by Saint Anthony and leading a slave revolt, you know, in the Congo, and so on, or like what does it mean to be possessed by a saint, you know, and so on and so forth. And you get like you know, what happens when your idols are burned, or like, you know, your statues and your sacred instruments and your medicines are taken from you forcefully, and you're shipped off to a different part of the world to become a slave, one of the worst things that can happen to you, right? You know, and what happens when those ancestral memories are passed down and told down the generations and changed over time. So it's a bloody and awful history, right? You know, that comes with the question of like, you know, a body can be colonized, but so can a mind, right? You know, what happens when your stories are ripped from you and you no longer remember the names of your old gods, you know, or you no longer remember sort of certain narratives, and how do you like take the new thing and make it something that feels familiar, you know? And so like there's a lot of different African traditions. Like Africa's a massive continent, right? You know, and so like the ways that say Congolese and Jeje and Fombe sort of traditions interact in the New World is different when the Yoruba come last, and the Yoruba have, you know, the Orishas who come in last and sort of like change other African traditions, because, you know, you get like people from warring tribes who are brought over and now they're on the same place and they have to essentially deal with the fact they're in the same circumstances and they can't be warring anymore, and they become in a way like allies, you know. So then traditions that were you know, like very much against each other are now fusing. So it's a whole like messy way that the yoke of slavery and Christianity is forced onto people, and it causes all these syncretisms, you know, which come with a very awful and bloody history, but it also created a lot of like new forms that interacted with the indigenous people who are now in the Americas, right? Versus African countries that were, and people who were not taken, and how their traditions changed. When you have like, I believe Nigeria is almost 50% Christian and 50% Muslim, but then there's like lots of still like existing practices and priesthoods of older gods, you know, and how do they interact with Islam and how they interact with the Christianity they encounter and what kinds of Islam and Christianity they encounter. So like it's a long story, and I'm not a scholar of those particular traditions necessarily, but I think there's I'm trying to remember the names of some books. If I remember them, I'll like bring them up later. But like there's a lot of really interesting materials that are coming out now about the way that sort of particular societies, especially in West Africa, the way they understand the world becomes syncretized with Christianity in places where they find a lot of agreement with them and they like it a lot, and in places where there's disagreement, and sort of how things are mediated and shifted through this new spiritual economy that occurs.
And like kind of similarly for traditional medicines and kind of healing practices, how does that and Christian magic and like increasing, maybe I'm thinking too modern, but like medicalization and kind of institutionalization of like healing practices, does that have a relationship that you know about? Like,
you mean like what happens when your village healer is declared a fraud and you should have gone to this other place instead?
Yes.
Something like that? Yeah. So there's also like a capitalist politics to that too, right? You know, like where you should be spending your economic attention, right? You know, is it the person who's, you know, the sort of your cultural healer, or is it, you know, this particular pharmaceutical company, you know? And especially becomes a case of effectiveness. People will, well, if this medicine is doing better, then I'm going to use this one, you know. But on the other hand, there's the spiritual dimension of these practices and the thing that they're solving other problems than just bodily ailments, you know. Yeah. They're also performing a social function for the group. And it's hard to talk about these things. That's why I'm hesitating. It's hard to talk about it when it's general, right? It's easier to be like this practice, this language, this cultural group, you know, and this particular place and time, and this is what happened to them, you know. And there's great studies on various different examples of that, right? So it really depends on where. But I think it's not just a matter of religion, there's also a capitalist angle there too, and how it's transforming economic systems in places where it gets colonized, right? Yeah. Especially when things were shared perhaps among a community in one instance, but now it's become something about monetary exchange, and some people having more access to the medicine than others because of the money and so on.
I just want to add a thing on that, because you know, you bring up traditional medicines, you're going to find psychedelics, of course. And so a lot of traditional uses of psychedelics show really interesting examples of the syncretism between Christianity and like indigenous practice. Mm-hmm. In Toronto in particular, there's a pretty large gathering of the Native American church, and they call themselves a church, and they are down with certain Catholic practices, but they also retain a lot of their more ancient indigenous beliefs. No, it's not Santo Daime. Native American church is different. They use peyote particularly. Okay. Yeah, so they have a really interesting blend. I talked to someone who runs some of these ceremonies, and he said that what they do is there's sort of an idea of there being like a more central, essential core to like all spirituality. You'll find this very often in that, you know, you can put certain metaphors on it, dress it up in a certain way, and the person who leads the ceremony will tailor depending on which group he's speaking to. If there are people who understand the Christian symbols, he'll talk more according to those in the peyote ceremony, versus if somebody isn't there, or if the whole group has shared knowledge with a different symbol set, perhaps one that's more indigenous, then they'll use that instead. But they still see it as being legitimate to use both of those things together. And then you also have things like Santo Daime, which is very similar. I'm trying to think of other examples. Do you want to say something?
I wanted to speak to that too, but totally.
Cool. No, I just wanted to mention that specific example, because there's a big church in Toronto, and you have people gathering to do peyote under these interesting symbolic pretexts on an almost weekly basis. And they have legal exemption to do that as well, which is really interesting. Mm-hmm. They can even bring it across the border, no problem. America and Canada both have.
Is that the same for ayahuasca and like?
That one's a little, like, I'm not really sure about what that is, but I know that there are some problems surrounding it that there aren't surrounding peyote. Peyote, there is like a legal agreement. It's in the law. You can't persecute people for carrying it around if they are of an indigenous background.
Right. Okay.
Did you want to add as well?
Yeah, just because of your question about sort of the interaction between Christianity and indigenous forms of spirituality, right? And specifically, you were talking about African-based spiritual systems. It's really interesting to like keep in mind, from my understanding, like Orisha worship, even traditionally and indigenously, is considered monotheistic in a sort of broader sense. in the fact that there is the creator God, and the Orishas are seen as agents of God, and not necessarily a God in the same way that we talk about in like a Greek pagan sense. And so already there was sort of this room for these kind of cross-identifications. And with certain practitioners, I'm thinking about like Espiritismo and like Afro-Cuban spiritist practices. It goes back to what you were talking about with hierarchy and effectiveness. It's that interesting subversion and reclamation of power, and also sort of collecting spirits.
And the elevation aspect of Espiritismo.
Right? And that like Espiritismo sort of pulls in the saints as just another group of spirits to be worked with that are closer to creator deity. And there's that colonial legacy of indigenous spirits being more pagan and rougher and farther away. But it kind of just blends together into a narrative. And there's an ease to that as well because it's based in the experiences of the practitioners. And so that sort of the more philosophical side kind of sometimes takes a step back because it's like, well, St. Anthony came to me in this dream and told me to do this thing. So I'm going to do the thing. And St. Anthony is now walking with me. And that kind of idea.
Also, like, speaking to that, like, a lot of the Orishas, one of my really close friends is an Orisha priest, and, a lot of them are syncretized with particular saints, but then you have the big major ones like Obatala who are syncretized with Jesus, and so you get this, it's a mirroring of that particular relationship. It's also interesting, like in Brazil, Umbanda takes a lot of different African traditions, like the mixtures of peoples who came over, as well as indigenous healing practices, but then blends it with theosophy, because theosophical writings, like, Madame Blavatsky and so on, were some of the first ones that came to Brazil in terms of like alternative spiritualities,
That's cool.
So they were like so this was the hottest thing to own, like these books, right? And so it also now reinforces European stereotypes, because then it's like, well, if you want to seem real, and if you want to seem like your particular group is authentic, and you have to like model off these books, so then spirits start changing and being organized in different ways, and the cosmology of the spirits start to become ranked. So you have like this idea that like it could organize every kind of spirit in the world in these particular rays, as they're called. So you have like, these are and it becomes very racialized, by the way, because you get like, these are the Indian spirits, these are the Muslim spirits, these are the particular, like, these are the old blacks, the first slaves who came over, these are like, pretos velhos is a term, old black, literally, caboclos is like, indigenous spirits and so on. And so you get this idea, this like idea of elevating them, but you also get this idea of like, they can all share the same altar. You can serve all of them, make them all offerings on the same altar, and they just have different ones, And so that's the interesting thing about like Creole traditions and syncretic renewable traditions, is because they're grappling with this problem of a plurality of peoples and a plurality of interpretations of even the same traditions. And how do you make them fit and be something people are comfortable with, but also need to mold themselves to adhere to? So it's this interplay of who is like being who is performing, but also how are they being performed by doing this, and so on. So it's a very fascinating thing that I think is really interesting, because there's this tension between how do you respect people's experiences of these spirits, whereas also making them kind of agree to an organizational structure, right? And you need sort of like, that's why theosophy becomes so popular, because they need to kind of, the need is being fulfilled is how to like make everything fit in the same system, right? But there's problems with that too, because there's a colonial angle to that, is to make everything as European as possible, because that makes them more legitimate, And then there's a resistance to that in the 70s and the 80s with the re-Africanization movement, which tries to make everything look more African in a sense. But then the problem is like, what happens what kind of African, right? So certain voices get privileged. The Yoruba words become applied to everything, even when everyone's speaking Portuguese, so why do I have to use Yoruba words? It's like, well, the reason is because we want to make it like re-embrace an identity, and then filling in knowledge gaps and memory gaps, but then other voices get pushed out. So like the Jeje and the Fombe ones get pushed out, and the Congolese ones get pushed out, and Kimbundu words are no longer used because we should use the Yoruba words. So it's a contentious thing, right? But that's the sort of the mixing ground, or like of these traditions where these issues are not solved. They're being negotiated by every individual temple. And when you go to one, it can look very different than when you go to the other. And that's the thing about oral traditions. It's not being codified, so it depends on how you learn it from who and where. So it's going to look different than the guy across the street. The temple's doing something completely differently. It doesn't mean that the question isn't who's doing the real thing. They're all doing the real thing. It's just that they're all doing it differently, and that's what happens when it's oral. It's practiced through communication, and it's not codified.
I have one quick thing, and then we'll get to Joe's question, which will be the last question. I think it's also important, I mentioned the Native American Church, it's important to outline the motivations for them becoming a Native American church. there was a time when it was illegal for natives to gather in their own settings. And so if they put a Bible on the table, then the white man would leave them alone.
Mm-hmm.
And so in order to maintain and provide a cover for their own practices to allow them to resist that colonial force, they put a Bible on the table, they learned its language, and they learned to speak according to it. And that's why it's there. That's why the Native American church came about. It was a tool for them to be safe. And that's very common from what I know from the traditions you talked about.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, you sort of cover that as a safety net.
Sorry, yes,
Very quick question. I'm not going to take up time asking this, but when you were introducing yourself, you were talking about having the masters in Kabbalah. I've been studying this for several years, and I've been really hitting a brick wall in Toronto about where to study Kabbalah. And I was just wondering if after class I could talk to you for a few minutes about some other options.
Yeah, absolutely. I don't come from a Jewish background, and I don't personally identify with any groups on Kabbalah, but there's also the questions, what Kabbalah is and where does it come from, and is it are you looking at it from a particular Orthodox, background, or is it from a New Age background, or is it from a Christian background because it's Christian Kabbalah, and also the Kabbalah Center, these big multinational groups, versus getting it from a particular rabbi, it's a very different kind of Kabbalah that's being studied, right? So my master's was kind of on actually the idea of what happens when a closed practice becomes universal, and sort of how does that work with terms of legitimacy, is it the same thing anymore? How is it different, or is it real Kabbalah? And he's kind of unpacking these definitions and so on. But yeah, thank you for that. We can talk afterwards.
Some of my questions are actually relevant
Oh, wonderful,
to what
yeah.
you're talking about. Thank you.
All right, last one, Joe.
Yeah, so I've been studying Tibetan Buddhism, where one of the main tenets of it, or ideas of Tibetan Buddhism, is the idea of transforming negative into positive, right? A lot of the demons in Tibet were converted or taught. They were preached the Dharma by Padmasambhava, a sorcerer, and they became Dharma protectors, right? And my question is if historically as a culture, and open this up to the both speakers in the room, I want to get some feedback. If we know historically that slavery is an evil, and we have equated the summoning of spirits to enslaving them, why are we using our magical powers to emancipate these spirits and prevent them from being used and controlled? And if these, why aren't we trying to get all these demons to be purified or to be released from hell, to be saved? Because if we can get Lucifer to become a Buddhist, or at least, or even just to return to be an archangel, I mean, he was the best of us, right? If he can't be saved, how can any of us be saved?
Well, it also depends on who you ask, right? And I remember we were talking about a Yazidi a while ago, where Lucifer is the best angel because he didn't bow to men, right? So he ends up being elevated to position. Those are theological questions, right? That for in terms of practice and so on. I would say that we've talked a lot about subjugating spirits and forcing them to do things, right? But not all magic is like that. Some are very much about having a respectful relationship with the spirit, that you have mutual boundaries and you offer to that being and it does something for you, and vice versa, and you can leave that relationship if you want to. It doesn't have to be permanent.
That's
Yeah. So a lot of folk practices are very much mutual, and sort of the idea is you don't want to piss them off because they're more powerful than you, so you gotta but also you don't want to boss them around necessarily, and so on. So not all Christian magic is very much about this sort of bossing demons around, So my point is there's variations to this practice. We were highlighting that because of the question of authority, right? And the question of this top-down approach of knowing whose boss is who, which plays a big role in not just Christian but a lot of pagan magic, right? But there's always other ways to do things, right? You have lots of practice that have very much to do with mutual, pious almost relationships with spirits and gods, little gods as well as big gods, and the project for what's your aim is sometimes, making sure this result happens, making sure I get money, for example. But then there's the bigger question that you're putting to, which is the metaphysical sort of relationships of these beings, right? What's their state, which is something that there aren't too many texts on about, because a lot of them are much more concerned with practical ends. But maybe some of the, with the question I answered earlier, the whole reveal to me the truth of reality, or do this ritual so that I can get a better sense of the world and understand sort of on a more ontological level what things are going on. Getting into sort of a non-dualistic thinking, maybe that's what people who were doing those kinds of things were doing, is trying to figure out, what really is the difference between these spirits, and are they really all one at the end of things, and so on. So it depends on sort of the way things are being addressed, and also realizing that like some I forget the name of this guy, and I really wish I did because it's really like pissing me off that I don't remember this. But there's this great quote by a Renaissance magician who was working a grimoire that involves subjugating demons, and he's complaining that witches who are living in a different village or something like that are able to summon the same demon and be friends with him. In a way, like just have him, they don't have to go through this purification period. They don't have to go through this long process of doing all this stuff and abstaining from all these things and actually going about their way of summoning the spirit. And then even when I do, it doesn't really show up, Whereas this woman rides him through the night, like a steed, like a horse. How is she able to do that?
Is it because instead of asking him for something, they ask him, how is he?
How are you feeling, Belphegor? Paimon, how are you doing today?
Yeah.
You having a bad day? Me too. I don't know, right? Because that's just a guy's diary entry, essentially, right? But that's the thing with like a lot of people see like witches as non-human beings who are changed by their relationships with spirits, or they were born that way, or whatever like that. Why are they able to have an easier grasp of these things? Is it because they have a more mutual relationship with the spirit? Not every witch is like that. There's a lot of witchcraft traditions that are very much about bossing spirits around. There's a little quick anecdote. I was talking to, I believe it's the neighbor of one of my grandmothers, and she was talking about this hag spirit with these long sagging breasts, and she's all wrinkly and ugly, and she just crawls on the edge of the wheat field, and she's called Baba sometimes, like a grandma, like not so affectionately, and she's talking about how you have to banish her because it's not her time yet, And I'm just like, how do you banish the spirit? What complicated ritual do you use to get the spirit to, leave you alone because she can cause disease and, melt your crops to the ground and cause all these problems for you? It's like, and she goes like, this is the translation. So I go over to her, when I see her at the edge of the field, and I go, fuck off, it's not Tuesday. Tuesday's when I bring you the chicken, And so I was like, well, what happened? And she's like, well, she went, eh. And she went off, and it's just like, so they figured out a way to deal with the spirit, right? It's like, okay, well, Tuesdays is your day, and that's when you get the chicken. And then you leave us alone because you're a nasty bitch, And then there's other ones that are more friendly, and you get to just kind of be like, oh, okay, cool, teach me glamour, I want to be beautiful, teach me fairy, and so on and so forth, And there's other ones which is just the baba, and you want her to leave you alone because she's nasty. And she reeks, apparently. She smells awful. So that's kind of, again, economies of interaction and spirit agencies is super different. It's not super binary, right? There's some spirits who are pests. It's like, why don't you let every animal in your house? Like, why do you kill spiders, or why do you, toss out, things that are rotting your vegetables and so on, but you're nice to your cat, So it's the same thing with spirits sometimes. It's like some are friendly and they're your friends, and you can hang out with them, and some are just nasty, and you got to tell them, fuck off, it's not Tuesday.
Treating them like animals?
Well, what I mean is like, who do you give your affection to? That's just a metaphor, right? Because especially things that are considered to be more powerful than you, you gotta like make sure they don't screw you up, right? So you gotta be in their good graces. And other ones like will not screw you up because they're more friendly, and you can have more, like with the familiar question, with a lot of like English witchcraft, is this idea that the familiar spirit is essentially someone who's an ally of you. Sometimes it's an ancestor, it's a dead person from ages ago, and sometimes it's a fairy, sometimes it's your lover, it's your husband or your wife, and sometimes it's someone who's a bit more morally ambiguous, and you have to navigate that relationship in a tense line. So again, these are just speculations on practitioners. We're no longer talking about like necessarily theology or perspectives on this. This is very much about the experience of a particular person who's going into trance and talking to spirits and how they're dealing with that relationship, or a community.
Yeah, I mean, I guess it means that like if you're trying to control a spirit, I mean, that just says something about you. And if you might control people and stuff like that, and really it's about compassion for people and spirits too, treating them with everyone with compassion and respect, like in a Buddhist context, right?
What I meant with the hag metaphor was, well, the story is, the anecdote is about like there's some spirits that are just nasty, right? There's the poludnica who comes and like murders you if you're out at noontime in a wheat field, or tells you riddles and then cuts your throat and gives you like madness and stuff like that. How do you get her to not do that? So there's like practices like we make little dollies to her, and stuff like that, and it's not always the same attitude towards that, right? Because she likes to fuck with people, as apparently to Surrey, right? So how do you mitigate that? Solve her riddles, or make sure you're not outside at noon, or if you need to be outside at noon, keep a particular amulet that tells her, not me, I already sacrificed to you, we're good. And then she'll leave you alone, and so on. So yeah.
So I think Jay wanted to say something. Did you want to?
Oh yeah, I just wanted to keep talking.
Okay,
that's great.
well.
I love it.
I mean, if I was going to end now, I think we have the room until now, right? Just until 9. Cool. So maybe, you're welcome to mill about and have general
You guys have great
conversations.
questions, by the way. Thank you so much, all of you. Thank you for being here and for asking amazing questions.
Yeah, and if y'all want to keep talking, go ahead. But as of, insofar as it needs to be official, this is the official end of the event. But if you want to discuss, please do. Yes, and thank you very much for your knowledge.
You're